For centuries, the Vatican has kept secrets that would make anyone's hair stand on end. Today, we are going to cross the line between what is allowed and what is forbidden. Get ready, because these 20 mysteries will not let you sleep peacefully. Let us begin. The skull of the Apostle John, human or non-human. Some relics inspire devotion, others command respect, and then there are those that plant a fear so deep it cannot be described in words. In the very heart of the Vatican, hidden behind layers of protocols, oaths of silence, and hallways where history and faith become indistinguishably entangled, lies one of the most disturbing objects ever to touch sacred ground. A skull that has been attributed for centuries to none other than the Apostle John. But what is disturbing is not its supposed holiness, but rather what science has begun to reveal about its nature. The official story says little. Just a few dusty lines in the internal inventories of Vatican relics identify the skull as belonging to the beloved disciple. For centuries, it was venerated in secret, kept inside an ornate urn that only a privileged few have ever seen. It is said that even some popes have prayed before it, seeking spiritual guidance, although none ever spoke of it publicly. At first glance, it might appear to be just one more of the many sacred bones found in churches and monasteries across Europe. But when, in the 1960s, the skull was subjected, discreetly, even clandestinely, to modern studies by a forensic team tied to the Vatican Secret Archive, everything changed. The records of that study appear in no scientific publication. They were preserved solely in an internal report, of which only a few pages were leaked decades later. On those poorly scanned, partially redacted sheets, one can read something truly chilling. The bone structure of the skull, though similar to that of a human, presents anomalies that are impossible to ignore. The shape of the cranial cavity, the angles at which the facial muscles attach, and even the bone density in certain key areas do not match what would be expected from a human being of the first century. One of the scientists involved, Dr. Giovanni Luraschi, fled the Vatican shortly after the study. According to his niece, who gave an anonymous interview to a German television network in the 1990s, Luraschi had claimed that the skull did not belong to any known human. He spoke of an intermediate species, of a bridge between heaven and earth, and said that, if this skull belongs to the Apostle John, then John was not like us. After making that statement, Dr. Luraschi vanished from public life. No one knows if he was silenced or if he simply sought anonymity out of fear. The most unsettling part of the case is that some theological documents from the early centuries of Christianity seem to allude, in veiled language, to John's physical uniqueness. In certain apocryphal Gospels, considered heretical by the Church and suppressed for centuries, the apostle is described as a being with a hypnotic gaze, a voice that resonated even without sound, and skin that was neither the color of men nor that of angels. Some have interpreted these metaphors as symbols of holiness, but others, especially modern scholars of esoteric Christianity, believe that these texts were describing a real, physical, and palpable difference. What is certain is that John, unlike the other apostles, did not die a martyr. He was not crucified, stoned, or beheaded. According to tradition, he simply disappeared. Some texts describe him ascending to heaven. Others refer to him as an eternal watcher, who still walks among men, awaiting the return of the Messiah. This peculiarity has also fueled theories linking him to non-human beings, to entities from another realm, even to visitors from other worlds. It may sound far-fetched, but when biology does not match history, imagination becomes as valid a tool as any other. But let us return to the skull. How did it get to the Vatican? Here begins another layer of the mystery. According to marginal notes in a 15th century relic inventory, the skull was brought to Rome by a group of crusaders who claimed to have found it in an underground chamber in Ephesus, Turkey, the place traditionally believed to be where John spent his final years. Those men never spoke of the discovery again, and it is said that all of them died under strange circumstances shortly after returning. Curiously, there are no local records in Ephesus of such a relic ever being there. In fact, archaeologists who have studied the region over the past century claim that no ossuary linked to John has ever been found. However, there are unclassified reports that speak of tunnels sealed by the Vatican during excavations in the 1930s. Testimonies from Turkish laborers hired by European clergymen mention chambers covered in unknown inscriptions and a skeletal figure with an enormous head at the center of a semicircular altar. None of those workers were ever seen again. Confidentiality contracts were signed, and the tunnels were sealed with cement. In their place, a small little-known chapel was built, far from the tourist circuit. But those who have managed to enter report a heavy, almost suffocating atmosphere. Some claim to have heard voices in languages they do not recognize, coming from beneath the altar. As the years go by, the insistence of independent researchers has been bringing increasingly chilling details to light. For instance, in 2 leaked photographs of the skull from 1988, where the cranium can barely be seen inside an opaque glass case, one particularly disturbing anomaly is visible. The frontal bone has a slight central protrusion that, according to experts in evolutionary morphology, resembles pre-sapient skulls or even those of unknown hominids. Others point out that it looks like the intentional cranial deformations practiced by Mesoamerican cultures, which, of course, would be impossible for a Jew from the 1st century. The official Vatican explanation is, unsurprisingly, silence. They do not deny the existence of the skull, but neither do they confirm it. They say it is one of many unverified relics, and that there are no plans to subject it to further study. However, some priests who have worked in the relic section affirm that its access is more restricted than that of any other object, more so even than the spear of Longinus or the remains of Peter. One of them, under condition of anonymity, revealed that only the Pope has the authority to view the skull without prior permission, and that there are specific prayers that must be recited before approaching it. So, what exactly is this skull? A misunderstood human deformity? A medieval hoax taken too far? Or is it, as some have begun to whisper in the darker hallways of the Vatican, proof that the Apostle John was not entirely human? Perhaps, as John himself said in his Gospel, there are also many other things that Jesus did, which, if they were written one by one, I suppose that even the world itself could not contain the books that would be written. Perhaps among those things is his true nature, and that of those who walked beside him. The Dark Manuscript of Father Ernetti. When speaking of Father Pellegrino Ernetti, it is easy to slip into the realm of the fantastic. His life, seemingly devoted to sacred music and the study of Benedictine theology, hides within its pages one of the most bewildering stories ever to brush against the walls of the Vatican. This is not a legend forged from convent rumors, nor a popular myth born of rural superstitions. It is a documented case with names, dates, photographs, newspaper articles, and above all, a manuscript. A text that was never meant to be written. A document that, according to those who read it, dismantles the very idea of linear time and reality as we know it. Father Ernetti was born in Italy in the year 1925, and he was a brilliant man, trained in physics, philosophy, and ancient music. His profile seemed to be that of a devout academic, one of those who get lost in Gregorian scores and medieval manuscripts. However, in the early 1950s, his life took an unexpected turn. Through his research, according to his own words, he began to take an interest in the possibility of capturing vibrations from the past. The theory, seemingly innocent, was that every sound, every image, leaves an indelible trace in space, like a wave that never fully fades. And if that were true, then at some point it would be possible to retrieve them, read them, reproduce them, to see the past. This concept, which today sounds like science fiction, was the foundation of a project he named the Chronovisor. And he was not alone. In his boldest confessions, he claimed to have worked with a team of 12 people, among them renowned scientists, some of them linked to the Vatican itself. One of the most notable names was that of physicist Enrico Fermi, who allegedly collaborated anonymously before his death. The device, described by Ernetti as a collection of antennas, cathode tubes, and special alloys, supposedly allowed the tuning into moments of the past as if they were old radio broadcasts. The story becomes even more dizzying when examining the events surrounding the first major test. Father Ernetti claimed to have witnessed, through the Chronovisor, a performance of the tragedy Thyestes by Quintus Ennius, a Roman play lost for over 2,000 years. He claimed to have recorded it and transcribed it word for word. What astonished people was not just the boldness of the claim, but the fact that he published a fragment of that play in an Italian newspaper, with a level of linguistic fidelity that baffled several experts in archaic Latin. Years later, some philologists tried to discredit the transcription, accusing him of fabricating it. But the truth is that none of them could explain how someone without access to such specific archaeological sources could have imitated with such precision a dialect that is almost neither taught nor studied. But the episode that sealed the fate of the Chronovisor was another, far more delicate one. Ernetti claimed to have witnessed the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. According to his account, the device allowed him to tune into Golgotha, see the face of the Nazarene, hear his last words, and even distinguish the expressions of the Roman soldiers and the lament of his mother. He claimed to have taken a photograph of the event. That image, blurry and of dubious origin, was circulated by several media outlets and was immediately rejected by the Vatican, which never admitted nor denied its authenticity. Many called it a fabrication, but the disturbing part was the absolute silence that surrounded its publication. No rebuttal, no official clarification, as if touching that subject was too risky even for the Holy See. What is most disturbing, however, is not the existence of the Chronovisor, nor even the visions of the past that Ernetti described in such detail. What is truly chilling is the manuscript he left behind before his death. A document that circulates in partial redacted versions, often translated and retranslated, filled with marginal notes and annotations that seem to have been made in haste. In it, the priest confesses to having been pressured by high-ranking Vatican officials to destroy the device. He says, in clear words, that he was forced to sign a public retraction in which he denied the existence of the Chronovisor, out of fear of the philosophical and theological implications of his invention. And more, he claims that the device was dismantled, that its components were sealed in secret chambers within Vatican City, guarded by a special order, and that they must never be reassembled. But among the most enigmatic lines of the manuscript lies a warning. Ernetti speaks of one final test, carried out in secret before destroying the Chronovisor. An experiment that, according to him, did not limit itself to seeing the past, but showed something else. Something that has not yet occurred. A fragment of future time that, he wrote, left him paralyzed for hours. He gave no details, barely hinted that it was not a war, nor a natural disaster, but a rupture in the very fabric of the human soul, something that would change faith forever, that would shake the notion of redemption. After that experience, he claimed to have understood that time is not a line, but a spiral, a labyrinth without a center, and that every attempt to observe it with human eyes creates unpredictable distortions. In his final words, he pleads that no one attempt to reconstruct the Chronovisor. He assures that doing so would be to invoke forces that neither science nor religion are prepared to comprehend, that looking into the past is to open a door with no guarantee it will remain closed. The manuscript was hidden for decades. Only one copy, allegedly stolen by a journalist friend of Ernetti, circulated in secret. Some claim that the version we know is not complete, that the original text contained formulas, diagrams, specific names. Some even claim that certain parts were written in an artificial language, created specifically to encode concepts that human language could not contain. Today, in the 21st century, when technology has erased the boundaries between the real and the virtual, the story of the chronovisor resurfaces with strength. Not because there is irrefutable proof of its existence, but because every detail fits into a logic that transcends dogma or conspiracy. Because even if it were all a fabrication, it was a fabrication too complex, too well structured to be ignored. And there remains one last shadow. On 2 occasions in the past 30 years, employees of the Vatican museums have reported the appearance of blueprints, notes, and technical diagrams among unclassified files, signed with initials that match those of Father Ernetti. No one has explained how they got there. No one knows whether they are copies, hoaxes, or warnings. But every time those documents emerge, the Vatican responds with the same thing: silence. A silence that, in certain corridors, weighs more than any word. The failed exorcism of Clara Germana Cele. The story of Clara Germana Cele is not just a footnote in the ecclesiastical records of southern Africa. It is an open wound in the invisible fabric that separates reality from the inexplicable. It is one of those cases the Church would have preferred to bury under layers of silence and oblivion, but which survives in the cracks of missionary archives and in the whispers of those who witnessed a scene too dark to be forgotten. It happened in the early 20th century, at a Catholic mission in Natal, in what we now know as South Africa. And since then, every attempt to document what occurred has been marked by confusion, fear, and a disturbing feeling that whatever manifested in Clara did not belong to the world of men. Clara was a young African girl, barely 16 years old, orphaned since early childhood, raised under the care of Catholic nuns at the St. Michael Mission. She was a brilliant student, dedicated and quiet. No one in the early years of her life would have imagined that she would become the center of one of the most intense and mysterious exorcisms of the last century. But the change happened, according to records from the time, suddenly. A transformation that left even those who had spent decades working among the poorest and most vulnerable, facing diseases, ethnic conflicts, and daily suffering, completely stunned. Nothing had prepared them for what Clara was about to reveal. It all began with strange behavior. The girl, who had once moved with humility and sweetness, began to speak with arrogance, in a deep voice that was not hers, in languages she had never studied. Phrases were recorded in Polish, German, ancient Hebrew, and Syriac, tongues that could not have been part of her educational environment. The religious community initially believed it to be a psychological crisis, perhaps stemming from unconfessed trauma or an undiagnosed mental illness. But those symptoms quickly evolved into a much darker, more visceral realm. One of the mission's priests, Father Horner, left writings describing how Clara developed an absolute repulsion to any sacred object. Mere visual contact with a crucifix was enough to unleash in her heart-wrenching screams, convulsions, and spasms that did not match any known medical condition. During one Mass, when the priest attempted to touch her forehead with holy water, Clara screamed with such force that several stained glass windows in the chapel vibrated, and some witnesses claimed they felt a pressure in their chest, as if an invisible force were trying to push them backward. But what happened in the weeks that followed was far more disturbing. Clara began to levitate, not in dreams, nor as part of some optical illusion, but in front of dozens of witnesses. Nuns, parishioners, even children, saw her rise several meters off the ground, with a rigid body, arms extended, and eyes completely white. On one occasion, according to a report by one of the nuns, she remained suspended for more than half an hour and did not descend until a priest recited a special litany that, in theory, was only known within certain Vatican circles. These manifestations triggered the call for an exorcist. The local diocese requested the intervention of Father Erasmus, a clergyman experienced in rites of liberation, respected for his seriousness and loyalty to doctrine. It was he who, along with Father Horner, began the formal exorcism process in the presence of several nuns and a few authorized laypeople. What they witnessed during those sessions was intense enough that most of them never spoke of it again. The few who did left harrowing accounts. Clara spat out fragments of metal without ever having ingested them. Her voice changed constantly, and at times seemed to emanate from her abdomen, not her throat. She insulted those present over their most intimate sins, even those never confessed. Father Erasmus wrote that during one of the sessions, Clara looked him directly in the eyes and said in a flat voice, "You stole the consecrated host when you were 10 years old. You hid it in your shoe and ate it like bread. No one saw you, but I was there." The priest acknowledged the act as true. He had never told anyone. The physical signs also defied all medical logic. Her body reached impossible temperatures, swinging within minutes from icy cold to burning hot. On more than one occasion, it was necessary to restrain her with reinforced straps because her strength seemed far greater than that of any teenager. Nuns trained in medicine stated that her pupils would dilate until they covered the entire iris and that her pulse would disappear for minutes without her breathing stopping. One of the most bewildering aspects was the duration of the exorcism. Unlike other documented cases, the process with Clara lasted weeks, almost 2 months, and in the end, there was no definitive liberation. In fact, the official record ends without a clear resolution. The final entry written by Father Erasmus reads as follows: "The entity has not been expelled. Clara has stopped responding to stimuli. She only looks upward. She seems to be observing something we cannot see." After this note, the file closes. There are no further reports. Clara was transferred to an inner convent under strict care and died shortly afterward under unclear circumstances. No autopsies were performed. No one was allowed near the body except for a small group of nuns who were forced to sign a confidentiality agreement issued directly by the Archdiocese. The Vatican never officially acknowledged the case. It did not deny it either, but neither did it validate it. It simply let it disappear. For decades, the name Clara Germana Cele was barely mentioned. Her story survived in fragments: an article in an African newspaper, a lost testimony in a theological journal, and a letter sent by one of the nuns who assisted in the exorcism, in which she claimed to have dreamt of Clara every night for more than 20 years. Always the same dream. Clara levitating, surrounded by shadows, with white eyes, uttering a single word the nun could never understand, a word in a language she did not know. In recent years, independent researchers have tried to piece together this forgotten puzzle. Some have found medical records that were deliberately altered. Others have interviewed descendants of people who were close to the case. Some even claim to have seen a black and white recording of the exorcism, preserved in a private collection, showing Clara moving at an unnatural speed, as if her body were being manipulated by something external. The question that arises after learning about this case is not whether Clara was possessed, nor even whether the exorcism was real. The real question, the one that lingers beneath it all, is why such a shocking episode, with so many witnesses and so much collateral documentation, was suppressed so effectively. What did the priests see in Clara? What entity manifested through her? And why did the Vatican choose silence? The truth is that the story of Clara Germana Cele did not end with her death. It remains alive, like a warning. One of those signs the Vatican would have preferred to erase completely, but which, like so many others, finds a way to return, again and again, from the edges of mystery. The Holy Child of the Catacombs who never existed. There are relics born from fervor, others from commerce, and a few, the most enigmatic, seem to emerge directly from a historical void impossible to fill. Among these is the case of the so-called Holy Child of the Catacombs, a mummified body venerated for centuries as if it were a martyr from the early days of Christianity, a symbol of purity, faith, and sacrifice. His tomb, adorned with flowers, candles, and small offerings from sick children, was for a long time a secret pilgrimage site within Rome. But when modern researchers decided to analyze the body using tools provided by contemporary science, they discovered a truth far more unsettling than any ancient heresy. That child, considered a saint for generations, never existed. At least not in church records, nor in official history, nor in the memory of those who should have known of him. The story begins in the mid-18th century, when the Roman catacombs experienced an unusual boom in excavations, explorations, and the transfer of relics. These were the days when Catholic powers competed to adorn their churches with the bones of martyrs, seeking symbols of incorruptible faith in the midst of a Europe beginning to waver between Enlightenment reason and the remnants of medieval fervor. It was in this context that a group of clergymen discovered, according to the official accounts of the time, a small sarcophagus embedded in a secondary wall of the catacombs of St. Calixtus, sealed with an early Christian symbol and bearing a Latin inscription that, they claimed, read, Innocentius Martyr. The discovery was received with jubilation. The body, small and surprisingly well preserved, was extracted and placed in a glass urn decorated with gold and velvet, where it remained for years in a small chapel annexed to a church on the outskirts of Rome. Descriptions from those who saw it spoke of a serene face, pale skin, and slightly rosy cheeks, as if death had held no power over the child. His figure soon received the nickname, the Little Angel of the Catacombs, and soon the first miracle stories began to circulate. Spontaneous healings, the disappearance of illnesses, prophetic dreams after touching the urn. Devotion grew, and with it, the mythology. But what was initially seen as a blessing became, over time, a thorny mystery. For when scholars tried to trace the history of the supposed martyr, they encountered a wall of inconsistencies. To begin with, the name Innocentius appeared in no known catalog of martyrs, nor in the lists of catacomb saints carefully compiled by generations of Christian archaeologists. The inscription that supposedly identified the body vanished a few years after the discovery, and the oldest photographs of the sarcophagus showed no visible inscription. There were only witnesses, secondary documents, and oral accounts that could not be verified with rigor. When the 20th century brought with it modern dating methods, the Church, very cautiously, allowed certain studies to be conducted on the body. The results were astonishing. Carbon analysis dated the child's death not to the early centuries of Christianity, as was believed, but to somewhere in the 17th century. That is, more than 1,000 years after the supposed martyrdom. By the time these results came to light, devotion to the Holy Child had already spread to several countries, and there were even printed images, novenas, and religious songs dedicated to him. The Vatican, instead of making the studies public, archived the results and simply declared that the body would be temporarily removed for preservation. It was never shown to the public again. But the most unsettling detail was not the timeline, but the very identity of the body. Upon examining the remains with more detailed forensic techniques, it was discovered that the skull had been artificially modified. The parietal bone had been filed down, and the upper jaw appeared to have been reconstructed with hardened wax, likely to give the face a gentler expression. The hair, originally dark, had been replaced with a blonde wig made of natural hair, sewn directly onto the scalp. The hands, covered by embroidered gloves, concealed fractured and partially decomposed fingers, held together with copper wire. Everything indicated that the body had been deliberately prepared to appear incorrupt, shaped like a macabre sculpture to fuel popular devotion. What followed was administrative silence. No official statement explained the situation. There were no public retractions or accusations of forgery. The Vatican simply allowed the Holy Child to fade from collective memory. as if he had never been there. Masses in his honor ceased. Pilgrimages were cancelled. In modern catalogues of saints and blesseds, there is no trace of his name. Only scattered records remain in old parish diaries, letters from missionaries, and a few blurry photographs that circulate among relic collectors. Over time, theories began to emerge. One of the most disturbing suggests that the body was not found, but intentionally placed in the catacombs by some group within the church, for reasons still unknown. Some researchers point to a period of great tension between different religious orders during the 18th century, when Jesuits, Dominicans, and Franciscans fought for influence within Rome. According to this theory, the creation of a new martyr would have served to provide one ecclesiastical faction with a sacred symbol to strengthen its position against the others. An invented martyr, yes, but an effective one. A child martyr who would not raise suspicions and whose purity would be taken for granted. Another, far more disturbing hypothesis suggests that the body may have been stolen from a hospital or convent, chosen for its physical characteristics, and manipulated with rudimentary techniques to simulate incorruptibility. This version, though extreme, is not implausible when considering certain internal documents detailing similar practices during the Counter-Reformation, when the Church needed powerful symbols to counter the spread of Protestantism. What was once veneration becomes, under this light, a kind of sinister performance in which faith is constructed with fragments of real bodies, sculpted to fit a predetermined narrative. Whatever the truth may be, the case of the Holy Child of the Catacombs leaves behind a deeply uncomfortable question. How many other relics venerated as sacred have origins just as ambiguous? How many stories of faith were built upon carefully crafted fictions? Because this was not a mere case of mistaken identity, nor an archaeological misunderstanding. It was a devotion promoted, blessed, and upheld for more than 2 centuries by institutions that knew, or at least suspected, that the child was not who they claimed he was. And the most disturbing thing is that, although the body has been removed from public view, its urn still exists. It is stored in a chamber within the Vatican, according to sources close to the archives, alongside other relics that have been quietly discredited. It is there, covered with linen cloths and guarded as if it could still provoke something. Some claim that despite everything, it remains intact, that its wax face still smiles serenely, that on full moon nights, maintenance workers hear the sound of small footsteps in the hallways near the archive. No one dares to verify it. No one wants to know if, beyond the fraud, something still remains, something that has not completely died. The Devil's Letter, the manuscript of the chained monk. There are manuscripts that survive wars, heresies, inquisitorial censorship, and the cruel passage of centuries, yet whose mere existence constitutes an assault on the established order. Texts that should not be where they are, written by hands that do not seem human, or worse, by humans guided by something deeper, darker, and older than any dogma. Among all of them, there is one that holds a very particular place in the history of the Vatican, the Codex Gigas, also known as the Devil's Letter, which, according to the Church's most confidential records, was written by a monk condemned to darkness while serving his sentence, chained inside a monastery. What makes the Codex Gigas a unique object is not just its size, although that alone would be enough to leave an unforgettable impression. It is nearly 1 meter tall, weighs over 70 kilograms, and contains more than 600 parchment pages. It was handwritten in such perfect calligraphy that some have suggested it was the work of a single person, writing in a trance or under supernatural inspiration. But beyond its monumental appearance, what transforms it into a deeply disturbing relic is its origin and content. The manuscript is currently preserved at the National Library of Sweden, far from the Vatican, but its story, its legend, its very essence, are rooted in the Church's most hidden secrets. The story begins sometime in the 13th century, inside a Benedictine monastery in Bohemia, in what is now the Czech Republic. There lived a monk whose name the texts never clearly reveal. He is identified only as the penitent scribe, a man who, according to accounts, committed such an abominable sin that he was condemned to be walled in alive. But, in a twist seemingly torn from the darkest medieval nightmares, the monk begged for his life and proposed an unthinkable solution: to write, in a single night, the largest book in the world, a complete compendium of human knowledge, history, medicine, philosophy, the scriptures, and, in his own words, the reflection of the duality between God and the adversary. The monastery superiors, whether out of curiosity or superstition, agreed. They sealed the monk in his cell, gave him ink, parchment, a candle, and waited for him to fulfill his promise. What happened that night remains a subject of debate. At dawn, the door was opened, and on the floor, surrounded by a circle of melted wax, lay the manuscript. Complete, perfectly handwritten, without errors, without signs of human fatigue, as if the author had been guided by a force beyond any physical limit. The monk, for his part, was in a catatonic state, his eyes wide open and a fixed smile that never left his face until his death, which came a few weeks later. Up to this point, the story is already strange enough to be remembered as one of those monastic legends that survive in the margins of folklore. But what came next was even more unsettling. The manuscript was sent to Rome for analysis and safekeeping, as it contained, in addition to traditional biblical books, apocryphal texts, medical formulas, magical spells, and, at the center of the volume, a full-page illustration of the devil, over half a meter tall, with a mocking expression, twisted horns, a bifid tongue, and beast-like legs. Nowhere in the book was there an image of Christ, Mary, or the saints. Only that figure, alone on a page with no accompanying text, eyes fixed, staring at the reader from the heart of the codex. Vatican experts soon classified it as a contaminated object, and although it was never officially condemned, access to it was restricted. For centuries, only a handful of cardinals were allowed to study its pages. Copies were made, reports were written, and according to unofficial sources, internal manuals were drafted on how to spiritually protect oneself before opening the Codex Gigas. Some of these manuals, leaked decades later, recommend fasting, prolonged prayer, and the prior reading of Psalm 91. Others warn that after a certain number of readings, recurrent nightmares appear, changes in dream language occur, and obsessive tendencies toward numerical patterns develop. One of the elements that most puzzled scholars was the structure of the text. At first glance, it appears to be an orderly compendium, with clear chapters and divided themes. But according to a former Vatican librarian, who gave testimony before dying in 1987, each time the codex is reviewed in full, the information appears in a different order. Some pages read normally, while others seem to change their content depending on who reads them. There are records of two scholars who, after reading the book simultaneously and comparing notes, discovered that their citations did not match, and that one of them had read an entire chapter the other claimed had never existed. Another particularly disturbing aspect is what modern researchers have called the hidden letter. On a middle page of the codex, written in a different script, there is a brief, unsigned text that some consider a confession from the original monk. It reads, "I have made a pact, not with words, but with ink. What is here was whispered into my ear by a bodiless voice. Let the reader know, whoever reaches the end will not leave unchanged." That message was kept secret for centuries. It was not included in later editions. Only when the codex was transferred to Sweden during the 30 Years' War, as war loot following the sack of Prague, did it begin to circulate beyond ecclesiastical walls. Since then, Secular researchers have tried to explain its origin, its possible falsity, its linguistic style. Some have pointed out that the change in handwriting could be due to a later alteration. But what no one has been able to refute is that the paragraph, whatever its origin, has provoked visceral reactions among those who have read it aloud. Some feel dizzy. Others have experienced episodes of depersonalization. Some claim that upon closing the book, they heard a distant laugh. Nothing definitive, but far too consistent to ignore. To this day, the Vatican keeps a classified copy of the Codex Gigas in its archives, carefully guarded. It is not a physical copy, but a set of transcriptions and studies that may only be consulted with papal authorization. It is known that at least 3 pontiffs have partially read the manuscript, but none has ever spoken about it publicly. Internal records show annotations indicating severe theological risk and content that may destabilize faith, but no detailed explanation has ever been provided. And beyond esotericism and legends, what truly terrifies the Church about the Codex Gigas is not that it was written by a monk in a single night, nor even that it contains dark passages or demonic illustrations. What makes it unbearable for the Church is that it challenges the very idea of revelation. If a human being, under extreme circumstances, was able to write such a text, then where does divine inspiration end and infernal interference begin? How many texts we consider sacred today were born under similar circumstances, in silent cells, among whispers from the invisible? The Codex Gigas, the supposed devil's letter, is still there, motionless, asleep. But those who have read it agree on one thing. The book is not complete. A part is missing. Perhaps torn out. Perhaps yet to be written. And if the original manuscript was, as some believe, only the first chapter, then the worst may still be yet to come. The Cursed Library of Castel Gandolfo. In the peaceful postcard setting of Castel Gandolfo, the papal summer residence perched above the dormant crater of Lake Albano, the last thing one would expect to find is one of the most feared, restricted, and shrouded collections of books in the entire history of the Church. Beneath the gardens and chapels resting on ancient Roman ruins, in lower levels absent from any floor plan available to the public, lies a hidden archive that is not to be confused with the Vatican's secret archive. These are not diplomatic texts, papal correspondence, or inquisitorial chronicles. This is something much darker. The Cursed Library, as some of the few who claim to have accessed its halls have named it. A collection of books that have, over the centuries, been linked to mental illness, unexplained deaths, and even phenomena that defy all logical reasoning. Its existence is not recorded in official documents. There is no public mention of it in the Vatican Museum's catalogs, not even in the restricted listings preserved within the inner circles of the Curia. However, former employees, certain religious scholars, and a minority of retired exorcists have left indirect evidence that this library exists, that it is active, and that no book that enters it ever leaves without leaving a mark. The history of this hidden archive begins, as far as it can be reconstructed from fragmented documents, during the papacy of Sixtus V in the 16th century, though it is believed that its oldest core originates from collections confiscated during the dark centuries of the Inquisition. While the Vatican Apostolic Library was devoted to preserving accepted knowledge, Castel Gandolfo began to receive everything that could neither be destroyed nor disseminated: grimoires, alchemical treatises, heretical texts of unknown origin, and manuscripts uncovered in excavations that no expert was able to translate. Unlike the Vatican Archive, where every consultation is documented and registered, here there are no rubrics, no available inventories, and no access is allowed without express authorization from the Pope. Whoever enters does so knowing that what they read may not allow them to return the same. What is most disconcerting is that the books stored there were not selected for their doctrinal content, but for their effect on the reader. Some caused nausea, others altered the perception of time, induced auditory visions, personality dissociation, or a deep inability to sleep for weeks. There is, for example, a record of a Babylonian volume written in an extinct alphabet which, according to internal reports, caused selective amnesia in those who tried to read it. Victims forgot essential details of their lives, names, dates, even language, and had to be rehabilitated in religious clinics under exorcistic treatment. Another text, dated to the 8th century and attributed to an unknown Germanic heretic, reportedly caused, according to a 19th century testimony, a documented case of mass possession in an Italian monastery, forcing the closure of the site for more than 10 years. During the papacy of Leo XIII, an attempt was made to transfer part of this library to the Vatican for more controlled study. The result was an incident that remains classified, but whose consequences can be inferred from the redacted memoirs of Cardinal Gennaro Bianchi, one of the custodians assigned to the operation. In a private note, Bianchi wrote, "The texts do not want to be moved. Some are like cages, others like doors. But there is one that is simply emptiness. When we opened it, it was like falling into a bottomless pit." That book was returned to Castel Gandolfo in less than 24 hours, escorted by cloistered monks armed with iron crucifixes. It is no surprise that the testimonies about this library are surrounded by contradictions and systematic silence. For decades, speaking of it within the clergy was grounds for immediate suspension. The few who did so spoke from the periphery. Substitute librarians, archivists who saw more than they should have, or accidental visitors who, for reasons still not understood, were briefly exposed to one of these volumes. One of the most documented cases is that of a German nun who, in 1974, during cleaning duties in Castel Gandolfo, found what seemed to be an unbound codex on a side table. She read 3 pages before a superior forcibly removed her. Since then, according to convent records, she lost the ability to speak and never communicated verbally again. Her personal notebook, which is still preserved, is filled with repetitive lines in distorted Latin, a blend of prayer and delirium, that ends with a phrase written 100 times. "The text is watching me." In recent decades, with the advancement of digital technologies and pressure from some more progressive sectors of the Church to release part of the knowledge hidden in its vaults, the idea of digitizing this cursed collection has been raised multiple times. The response, however, has always been the same. You cannot digitize what does not want to be copied. In an experiment conducted in 1999 by a group of conservation experts, an attempt was made to scan one of the anonymous 14th century texts. The resulting file showed completely black pages, no text, no illumination, as if the book had absorbed the very light. The equipment was inspected, the process repeated several times. Even infrared and ultraviolet spectrums were used. The result was identical. The official conclusion was that the manuscript was made with materials that poorly reflected light. The unofficial conclusion was that something else was acting upon those materials. The reason why the library remains in Castel Gandolfo and not in Rome is not logistical, but spiritual. This is suggested by an internal report dated 1962 and addressed to then Pope John XXIII, stating that the proximity of these texts to spaces where daily Mass is celebrated or where the body of St. Peter is preserved may generate metaphysical conflicts of incalculable consequence. Lake Albano, whose dark waters have been the subject of legends since pre-Christian times, would serve as a kind of natural barrier, a symbolic protection against the influence of the texts. It is as if, from its isolation, the library can contain its own horrors, to a certain extent. What is most disturbing, in the end, is not the existence of a collection of cursed books. What is truly unsettling is that the Vatican considers there are texts that, due to their nature, should neither be destroyed nor revealed, but confined, as if some fragments of human or inhuman knowledge had a life of their own, and as if certain thoughts, once written, could never be undone. Perhaps the truth lies written there, among those pages that bleed ink and silence. Or perhaps simply, there are ideas that were born from the abyss, and reading them is letting that abyss stare back at you. And so, beneath the perfectly manicured gardens of Castel Gandolfo, where popes once walked at dusk and recited the rosary with their hands clasped, that sealed library still sleeps. It breathes in its closed corridors, where no crucifix is sufficient, and where each book is not an object, but a presence. One that waits, one that remembers, and perhaps one that was never meant to be read by human eyes. The trial of Lucifer in the 17th century. In the most hidden archives of the Holy See, where documents are covered by centuries of dust, silence, and fear, there exists an untitled folder, sealed under the code Processus Obscura 1623. Its contents, though fragmented, gave rise to one of the strangest and most disturbing episodes ever recorded by the Church, the trial of Lucifer, an event that, were it not supported by real testimonies and internal documentation, would seem like the delirium of a theologian driven mad by isolation. However, all evidence suggests that, at some point in the 17th century, a group of high-ranking clergymen did the unthinkable. A secret judicial hearing convened to issue a formal judgment against Satan, the bearer of rebellion, the fallen angel, the eternal adversary. The details of this trial, carried out in absolute secrecy within the walls of the Vatican, remained a legend for centuries among the oldest archivists. Some considered it a theological experiment, a liturgical dramatization without consequences. But the few documents recovered, private memoirs, encrypted letters, records bearing the seal of the Holy Office, point to the event being real, deliberate, and extremely serious. It was, literally, an attempt by man to confront evil itself, to judge it as a legally responsible entity, and to establish, in juridical terms, its ultimate guilt for the evils of the world. The process began in the year 1623, during the papacy of Urban VIII, a complex and cultured pontiff, obsessed with the balance between science, theology, and power. At that time, Europe was ablaze. Religious wars bled the continent. The plague still hovered over entire cities, and internal conflicts within the church multiplied. It was in this context, and as a response to a series of prophetic visions reported by Carmelite nuns in Toledo, that an impossible idea emerged. If the devil acts as a moral agent, if he makes decisions and manipulates souls, should he not in theory be judged for his actions? Would he not have the right to defend himself, and the obligation to face his crimes? Thus, the Pope authorized, under the strictest confidentiality, the formation of an internal tribunal composed of 7 members of the Holy Office, including theologians, exorcists, and a canonical notary. They met for the first time in a sealed chamber inside the Apostolic Palace. There are no precise plans of the location where the trial took place, but some historians suggest it may have occurred in one of the underground rooms of the old papal prison, closed in the 18th century. The act was not public, it was not recorded in liturgical acts, and none of the participants could ever speak of its content. But the personal notes of one of the judges, found in a lost codex at the Monte Cassino Monastery, reveal that the process lasted 11 days. In those pages, written in a mix of legal Latin and biblical Greek, the atmosphere is described as suffocating with tension. Each session began with prolonged prayers, strict fasting, and the presence of sacred objects, as if they were expecting a real manifestation. And most disconcerting is that the manifestation came. According to the testimony of the tribunal's notary, during the 3rd session, a voice emerged from the void, a voice with no physical source, guttural and yet articulate, that answered the accusations with exact biblical quotes, with sarcasm and lucidity. It was not a demonic voice in a theatrical sense, but something far more subtle and dangerous, a brilliant, logical, cold mind that seemed to enjoy the process. The records show that the interrogation addressed complex topics: free will, the responsibility for original sin, the nature of temptation, and the existence of evil as an autonomous force. The responses of the accused, or of whatever manifested as Lucifer, were riddled with paradoxes. He claimed he had never forced anyone to sin, that humans fall by their own will, and that eternal punishment is God's doing, not his. One of the most cited fragments from these sessions says, "And what if hell is not my punishment, but my mission? What if my condemnation was accepted by me to balance what you call love?" This phrase deeply disturbed the judges, and according to internal chronicles, at least 2 of them left the room upon hearing it, unable to continue. During the 5th session, one of the exorcists attempted a rite of deliverance, convinced that it was a case of possession. What occurred at that moment was omitted from the documents, but later letters mention a crisis of light, an inexplicable visual phenomenon, and an altered state of consciousness that affected all present. Some spoke of loss of speech, others of tachycardia and recurring visions in the days that followed. From that point on, the process ceased to focus on condemning Lucifer and began to revolve around its very purpose. Why judge one who has already been condemned from the beginning? Was it legally, or even theologically, valid to hold a trial against a being whose nature is, by definition, the denial of judgment itself? The final session took place, according to the records, on a Friday at dusk. All the judges signed a closing act acknowledging that the trial had not reached a verdict. The trial was suspended, not due to lack of evidence, but because the accused could not be judged in human terms. It was argued that Lucifer's rebellion occurred outside of time, before the creation of man, on an ontological plane beyond reach. Therefore, he was not a subject of law in the traditional sense. The decision was archived under perpetual secrecy and sealed with a papal bull that prohibits its disclosure until the end of time. The document states this explicitly: "Until the Lamb returns, and with him the scales." Despite the documentary lockdown, the echo of the trial filtered through the years into the darkest corners of theological study. Some call it a heresy of monumental proportions, others a warning. There are those who claim that the act of confronting evil, of giving it a voice and a rational space, was itself a moral fall, a dangerous concession. The philosopher Girolamo Salviati, a member of the tribunal, spent his final years in a monastery of absolute silence, refusing to write or speak. His last manuscript, only 3 lines long, said, "We call him the enemy. He calls himself necessary." Today, the Vatican remains silent on this episode. It neither confirms nor denies it. Some Holy Office documents have been digitized in recent years, but those related to Processus Obscura remain classified as non-consultabili. However, persistent rumors suggest that some fragments have been shared with internal circles of exorcists as a warning. One of them, interviewed anonymously in 2009, said, "After that trial, the Church understood that evil is not to be debated. It is to be resisted, because in dialogue, he always wins." The trial of Lucifer remains one of the strangest episodes in Vatican history. Not because it sought to condemn evil, but because, for a moment, the Church considered that perhaps, just perhaps, the devil had something to say. And upon hearing it, something changed. Something that has not yet been fully revealed. Something that perhaps is still judging us from the other side. The saint who disappeared from the portrait. Among the many mysteries whispered with caution within the walls of the Vatican, there is one that, although often dismissed as mere superstition or a visual distortion attributed to fatigue or religious suggestion, has provoked a thick silence every time someone dares to mention it out loud. The gradual disappearance of a saint from a sacred portrait, a phenomenon so baffling that, according to some witnesses, it led to the closure of a small chapel and the immediate relocation of the painting to a private section, restricted even to ecclesiastical officials themselves. The story begins in the year 1948, when a community of Italian clerics, led by Bishop Carlo Restrelli, received the donation of an ancient tempera oil painting of unknown origin, apparently dated to the 17th century. The painting, almost 2 meters tall and in the Tenebrist style, depicted a canonical scene: the encounter between Saint Joseph of Cupertino, known as the Flying Saint, and the child Jesus in the arms of the Virgin. What was unusual about the painting was the expression on the saint's face, an absorbed look, almost lost in ecstasy, and an atmosphere that seemed to pulse with a light of its own, as if the oil were not merely a representation, but a presence. It was installed in a side chapel of the convent of Santa Cecilia in Trastevere in Rome without much ceremony, and from the very first moment, strange things began to occur. The first sign was subtle. The nuns who cleaned the room claimed that the figure of Saint Joseph seemed to change slightly from one day to the next. Sometimes his robe looked lighter, sometimes his face seemed to be looking in a different direction, and on other occasions, the figure simply appeared faded, as if the painter had forgotten to give definition to the body. At first, these observations were taken as simple optical illusions, caused by the natural light entering through the chapel's small windows. However, as the months passed, the alterations became more evident and harder to ignore. One of the most documented cases occurred in 1952, when a group of seminarians on a guided visit observed the portrait during the Vespers Mass. According to a written statement by one of them, the saint was not there. His place in the painting showed an empty space, a golden background without a silhouette, as if the figure had been erased from the canvas by an invisible hand. The child Jesus and the Virgin remained intact, with fine details and well-defined faces, but where Saint Joseph of Cupertino should have been, there was nothing except a slight ripple in the fabric. The most unsettling part was that the following day, the saint had returned, but not with the same features. His face looked slightly older, his robe darker, and his posture was no longer ecstatic, but contemplative. Bishop Rastrelli ordered an immediate analysis of the work. It was removed for 2 weeks, examined by Vatican art restorers, and returned with a report that provided no satisfactory explanation. The pigments were stable, showed no signs of uneven wear, and there was no evidence of repainting. One of the most experienced restorers, Master Giacomo Pindelli, even wrote in his private journal that the painting is still and alive at the same time, as if it breathes with a rhythm we cannot see. Despite the official conclusions, Rastrelli decided to install a small surveillance camera, an emerging technology at the time, to record any visual anomalies. What those tapes captured, and which are now preserved in analog format, is perhaps the most chilling point of the entire story. For more than 30 consecutive nights, the camera recorded subtle movements in the saint's figure. Not physical displacements of the canvas, nor sudden alterations, but a gradual visual decomposition. Night after night, the saint's face seemed to fade, as if something were absorbing him from within. His eyes grew dull, his mouth closed with a weary expression, and in some frames, a trace of moisture could be seen in the area where his hand was. That trace was never detected on the physical canvas, which makes the finding even more disturbing. In one of the recordings, dated the 27th night, the figure of the saint completely disappears for more than 5 hours, only to reappear the following morning. During that period, no light reflected in the place where he should have been. It was as if the saint had left, or was hiding. The Vatican was discreetly notified, and shortly afterward, a delegation led by then Cardinal Alfredo Ottaviani visited the site. The immediate closure of the chapel was ordered, the painting was moved to a private room, and absolute silence was imposed on the case. Monks, nuns, and visitors were asked to sign a confidentiality clause under penalty of excommunication. However, some records survived thanks to the private letters of Bishop Rastrelli himself, who documented every detail meticulously, convinced that he was witnessing a phenomenon of preternatural nature. In those letters, Rastrelli proposed unsettling hypotheses. The most persistent was that the painting was not a conventional work of art, but a spiritual portal. The figure of Saint Joseph, he wrote, had not been painted as part of the whole, but had been inserted through an act he described as liturgical visual, a kind of phenomenon in which the soul of a saint can manifest not through matter, but by using the image as a temporary body. According to this theory, the saint did not disappear. He stepped away, returned to his origin, or even descended to the world. The painting was his threshold, his garment, and his face changed depending on his contact with humanity. As absurd as this idea might seem, it resonated within certain mystical circles of the Eastern Church, where legends exist about icons that sleep or travel, and whose image fades when the spirit they represent leaves the earthly plane. In some monasteries of Mount Athos, there are even specific prayers to awaken the icons. What would be considered visual heresy in the West has been viewed in the East as a mystery of faith. After its relocation, the painting was kept in the Vatican archives, in a section dedicated to anomalous objects. It has not been exhibited since. According to persistent rumors, its figure continues to appear and disappear at irregular intervals, and there have been attempts to photograph it digitally, all unsuccessful. Modern cameras, curiously, cannot capture the saint's figure clearly. It appears blurry, wrapped in a sort of mist that affects only that section of the canvas. Some technicians believe it is a chemical reaction between the pigments and infrared light, but none of the analyses have been conclusive. There is even an internal document from the year 2006 suggesting that the painting has begun to exhibit a slight vibration perceptible to the touch, as if its surface were beating. And even more disturbing is the recent testimony of a restorer who, authorized to briefly inspect the condition of the canvas, claimed to feel an emotional presence when he placed his hand on the area where the saint's figure should be. He said, in a statement he never signed, that he felt overwhelming compassion, as if he were touching the memory of someone still waiting to be understood. Perhaps this is the only mystery in the entire history of the Vatican that does not involve demons, conspiracies, or hidden prophecies, but something more fragile and deeply human. The possibility that saints, far from being static statues in liturgical memory, still walk among us, appearing and disappearing, not by miracle, but by need. And perhaps that painting that breathes in the silence of a secret vault is not merely depicting a man in prayer, but keeping his struggle to remain alive. Even if only for moments, even if only within an old wooden frame that no one dares to hang anymore. The Underground Monastery beneath St. Peter's Basilica, among the many structures that form the labyrinthine complex of the Vatican, where narrow corridors intertwine with marble chambers, sealed archives, and private chapels, there exists a persistent rumor that has survived documentary purges, diplomatic denials, and the carefully cultivated silence of generations of clergymen. The existence of a hidden underground monastery directly beneath St. Peter's Basilica itself. This is not the well-known papal grottos or the official tombs that visitors can tour with a guided pass. This goes far beyond tourism or ceremony. It is said to be a sealed underground complex, invisible to the public, whose purpose has been, for centuries, the training and spiritual containment of individuals selected for their exceptional capacity for mystical perception. The few testimonies that have emerged about this place agree on one thing. It is not a common convent. It is not a retreat or contemplative community like those that have traditionally existed on the margins of ecclesiastical life. The so-called inner monastery of St. Peter would be, rather, a spiritual surveillance facility, a secret school of extreme training, a sort of faith laboratory where what cannot be taught in traditional seminaries is studied, and where that which must never be mentioned in pulpits or confessions is confronted. The history of this monastery begins to blur in the 4th century, at the dawn of imperial Christianity, when a monumental basilica was built over the place where the Apostle Peter was buried. It is said that during those initial works, underground passages were discovered that predated the very founding of Rome. Tunnels seemingly linked to older cults, whose symbols belong neither to the Latin pantheon nor to known religions. Some workers were dismissed without explanation. Others simply vanished. From that moment on, it was decided to build over the tunnels without exploring them in depth. But over the centuries, various popes, especially those more mystical or fearful of divine judgment, ordered private excavations, which revealed a system of chambers and corridors spiraling downward into increasingly deeper levels. In the 12th century, during the peak of monasticism, a small community was established within one of these spaces. They were not common monks. These were men chosen for their particular abilities. Some were exorcists, others had knowledge of ancient medicine, and some, according to certain documents, claimed to perceive presences or sounds unnoticed by others. The community was named Ordo Silenti, the Order of Silence, and it operated for nearly 300 years as an unofficial spiritual arm of the Vatican. Their task was to guard the most dangerous relics, transcribe manuscripts that no other scribe dared to touch, and above all, investigate phenomena considered mystical deviations, extreme cases of visions, bilocation, transverberation, and other inexplicable events. But what makes the monastery truly unsettling is not merely its history or foundation, but its continued existence over time. For according to internal documents declassified in 2004, as part of a process to digitize ecclesiastical archives, records from the 19th century still mention exchanges between the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith and the custodians of the 5th underground level. That level, never referenced in the official topography of the Vatican, matches the fragmentary description some workers have shared outside institutional channels. One such worker, a ventilation technician who was involved in restoration projects during the pontificate of Paul VI, recounted in an anonymous interview that, while inspecting a gas leak in a restricted section beneath the basilica, he found a reinforced door engraved with an inverted cross, guarded by two men in black habits with no visible insignia. He was ordered to leave immediately and signed a confidentiality agreement. Years later, already retired, he confessed that the experience left him with a feeling he could never forget. It was not fear. It was something else. As if something behind that door could see us without being seen. There are also leaked letters between members of the Swiss Guard mentioning the existence of passages locked with triple keys, whose access is granted only to the Pope and a small circle of priests with specific training. In one such letter, dated 1983, the brothers from the depths are mentioned, and it is noted, without explanation, that every few years, one of them emerges to the surface to deliver a report sealed with red wax, addressed directly to the Secretary of State of the Vatican. The inevitable question is, what is kept down there with such zeal? What justifies the existence of a completely isolated spiritual community whose activity is deliberately excluded from all official documentation? Some fringe theologians have suggested that the monastery does not serve a merely contemplative function, but instead has a mission of constant vigilance. That those men are not there to pray, but to contain. And what they contain is not symbolic. One theory that has quietly circulated in specialized circles suggests that beneath St. Peter's Basilica, there is a sealed chamber, known internally as the Crypt of Echoes, where an object of unnamed nature is kept. Some call it the Reliquary of the Scream, others the Sentinel's Urn. It is said to be a relic so ancient and dangerous that its mere presence requires the uninterrupted prayer of at least 3 trained monks, day and night, as if its power must be constantly neutralized by the sound of faith. On certain nights of the year, especially on the eves of Easter and Pentecost, unexplainable sounds are reported in the nearby catacombs, like a deep hum echoing through the walls, although no one has identified its origin. Another hypothesis, even more radical, proposes that the underground monastery functions as a seedbed for extreme mystics, people carefully selected from youth for exhibiting inexplicable phenomena, such as recurring visions, sensitivity to the energy of certain objects, or even the ability to enter trance states without external stimuli. These individuals are trained to serve as intermediaries between the visible and the invisible worlds. They do not take public vows. They are not ordained as priests. They are not allowed to maintain contact with their families. They live below, in cells carved from stone, in permanent fasting, praying in rotating shifts, and receiving instruction in dead languages, preconciliar rituals, and texts never translated into modern Italian. What is most disturbing, in the end, is not that a secret space exists beneath the epicenter of global Catholicism. What is truly unsettling is that this space is still inhabited, still operating, and that the Vatican has chosen to keep it alive in the shadows. It has not dismantled it. It has not officially denied it. It has not converted its chambers into tourist attractions as it has done with other archaeological zones. It has chosen to preserve it intact, as if it knows that something ancient and still active must be contained, observed, and understood from a place where logic has no jurisdiction. And if one stands today before the high altar of St. Peter's Basilica and listens closely during the deepest moments of silence, perhaps, from the depths below, a faint murmur may be heard, not the echo of the faithful's prayers, but something graver, deeper, like a prayer not directed toward God, but toward something that should never awaken. The lead angel, statues that weep blood. Among all the images that inhabit Catholic temples, few awaken as much fascination as statues. They stand as silent witnesses to the passage of time, sculpted in marble, wood, bronze, or plaster, representing saints, virgins, martyrs, and angels with the solemnity proper to the sacred. But in certain corners of deep Catholicism, far from the tourist bustle of Rome and the routes marked by ecclesiastical guides, there exists a statue that has puzzled faithful priests and scientists alike for decades. A figure that does not appear in official records, that has been moved more than once and whose behavior has been carefully silenced. The Lad Angel, a sculpture which, according to multiple witnesses, has wept blood on more than one occasion, always on dates linked to suffering or the downfall of key church institutions. The statue in question represents an archangel, with no name inscribed, its right arm extended and palm open, as if trying to stop an invisible evil. It carries neither sword nor trumpet, and its expression is far from the classic serenity of Baroque angels. There is something unsettling in its face, a mixture of compassion, weariness, and a sadness so tangible that, even without any unexplained phenomenon, it would be enough to sow unease in anyone who contemplates it closely. Its composition is equally unusual. It is made entirely of molten lead, a heavy, dark, opaque material associated more with poison and isolation than with the divine. Who sculpted it is unknown, but the first mentions appear in 18th century documents when it was discovered in the basement of an abandoned monastery on the outskirts of Perugia. Apparently, it had been partially buried, wrapped in black cloth embroidered with Kabbalistic symbols in gold thread. The monks who found it, puzzled by its weight and unusual appearance, decided to place it in a side chapel as an art piece without liturgical function. However, just days after being shown to the public, rumors began to circulate among parishioners. Reddish stains appeared under the angel's eyes, and those who observed it for long periods claimed to feel a void in the chest or an unexplainable melancholy. The situation escalated when, during Holy Week of 1792, the first documented case of blood weeping occurred. One of the nuns of the convent, Sister Beatrice, left a written testimony hidden among the pages of her diary. The angel weeps. The drops fall without sound. They are thick and dark. One sister fainted. I did not feel fear. I felt it was asking me for help. The next day, the chapel was closed and the statue covered with a white sheet, but the phenomenon did not cease. On the contrary, in the following days, the weeping increased, and similar stains began to appear on the folds of the cloth, as if the lead itself was exuding blood. Alarmed, the monastery superiors sent a letter to the bishop of the diocese, who discreetly notified the Vatican. A small group of scholars traveled from Rome to analyze the statue, and although no official report is preserved, fragments of correspondence between participants suggest that samples of the liquid were taken and it was determined to be human blood, though its origin was not identified. Curiously, one of those letters mentions that the red blood cells were abnormally dense and appeared to be in an advanced state of decomposition, but without having been exposed to air. No one could explain how a sealed, solid metal sculpture could release organic blood. The statue was immediately removed, transported to Rome under maximum discretion, and stored, according to some sources, in a side room of the Apostolic Palace. For years it was not spoken of again until it mysteriously reappeared in 1957, in the crypt of a minor church near the Vatican. There is no record of how it got there, but what is known is that it wept again on October 29th of that same year, the date when the scandal of the Istituto per le Opere di Religione, the well-known Vatican Bank, became public. Some Vatican theologians and analysts began to see a possible connection between the angels weeping and moments of moral crisis within the church. Since then, the statue has been viewed with almost superstitious fear by those who know its story. Some believe it to be a prophetic artifact, a kind of spiritual thermometer that reacts to the state of corruption within the ecclesiastical hierarchy. Others, more inclined towards Christian occultism, suggest that the lead angel was not created for veneration, but as a sealing entity, a receiver of unconfessed sins, which gathers collective pain and releases it in the form of tears when it can no longer contain it. This theory gained strength when reviewing internal reports from the year 2002, when the angel was again removed after a third episode of bleeding, coinciding with one of the greatest abuse crises within the church in the United States. During this last phenomenon, a team of independent restorers was called to analyze the statue's condition. One of them, Professor Angelo Falcone, recorded in his field notebook that, upon touching the sculpture's torso, he felt a slight vibration, like the hum of an old machine, and that the metal's temperature was unusually low, as if the statue absorbed heat rather than emitted it. Although later examinations dismissed any supernatural origin, attributing the phenomenon to internal humidity and undefined chemical reactions, the Vatican chose to remove the piece from the church permanently. Since then, its exact whereabouts have been unknown. Some claim it was sealed in a private crypt within the Vatican, others that it is in an underground chamber of the Gregorian Etruscan Museum, covered by an additional lead tarp to prevent new exudations. What few dispute is that the statue remains alive, in the most unsettling sense of the term. Because although it has no movement or visible will, its history seems synchronized with the darkest moments inside the institution that once housed it. In recent years, some independent researchers have tried to locate it, following the traces of internal transports, lost inventories, and restoration records. None have succeeded. However, in private forums and alternative theological circles, a photograph circulates taken secretly by a former seminarian in 1996, where the angel can be seen partially wrapped in blankets, stored in a dimly lit room. The angel's face appears cracked, with dark marks under the eyes, as if it had wept again. At the bottom of the image, handwritten, a phrase can be read: "It weeps for what no one dares to confess." This is how the lead angel remains in the memory of those who have known or dared to seek it. Not as a classic miracle, nor as a pious legend, but as a silent witness of hidden suffering, institutional guilt, and the unbearable weight of unredeemed sins. Because, in the end, what this angel expresses with each tear is not anger nor punishment. It is mourning. A mourning that drips slow, dense, and dark. A mourning that no one has been able to stop. The secret of Fatima that was never revealed. Throughout the history of modern Christianity, few episodes have generated as much fervor, suspicion, and controversy as the Marian apparitions of Fatima, which took place in Portugal in the year 1917. In that rural setting, marked by poverty, institutionalized ignorance, and the fear of a war that was already devouring half the world, 3 shepherd children, Lucia, Francisco, and Jacinta, claimed to have seen and heard a woman of light who appeared to them among the fields of Cova da Iria. What began as a private vision ended up becoming a mass phenomenon, followed by thousands of faithful and closely scrutinized by civil and religious authorities. That heavenly message, however, carried a disturbing element. 3 secrets entrusted to the children by the figure they identified as the Virgin Mary. And while the first 2 were revealed over the decades, the third, the most feared and enigmatic, remains the subject of doubts, contradictions, and theories that point directly to the heart of the Vatican's secret archives. The official version of the events was carefully managed by the ecclesiastical hierarchy. The first secret spoke of a vision of hell, as a warning about the fate of souls who reject God. The second predicted the Second World War and the rise of Soviet communism, if humanity did not repent and did not consecrate Russia to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. Both prophecies, though striking, fit within the theological and political framework that the Church could handle without too much scandal. But the third, the one Lucia dos Santos wrote by hand in 1944 and delivered to the Bishop of Leiria under oath, was sealed, hidden, and kept secret for more than 40 years. During that time, its existence generated a thick cloud of speculation. What could that text contain that not even the popes dared to disclose? Some cardinals privately claimed it was an apocalyptic prophecy. Others spoke of internal betrayal, a schism at the very top of the Church, or the assassination of a pontiff. It was even suggested that it described the moral collapse of the clergy and the infiltration of evil into the most sacred structures of the institution. In 1960, when Pope John XIII broke the first seal of the manuscript and read its contents, he decided not to make it public. He limited himself to saying that, "It is not for the judgment of the Church to reveal this to the world at this moment." Those words, ambiguous and full of fear, only fueled the mystery. It was only in the year 2000, during the pontificate of John Paul II, that the Vatican officially published the so-called Third Secret of Fatima. It described a symbolic vision, a bishop dressed in white, walking through a ruined city, climbing a hill among corpses and rubble, only to be killed by a group of soldiers. The text was interpreted as a prophecy about the assassination attempt suffered by John Paul II himself in 1981, an event he attributed to the protection of the Virgin of Fatima. And although this revelation seemed to close the prophetic cycle, many voices, inside and outside the Church, were not satisfied. Not so much because of what the secret said, but because of what it did not say. Because there was one detail impossible to ignore. The published document was a vision, not a message. It did not have the direct and discursive style that the other secrets had. It contained no instructions, explicit warnings, nor any allusion to the doctrinal content that had been suggested for decades. Moreover, the disclosed manuscript was written on a single sheet, while Lucia's original memoirs spoke of a longer text. This generated suspicion that the true text, or at least its most compromising part, had been suppressed. The Italian journalist Antonio Socci, in his book The Fourth Secret of Fatima, openly accused the Vatican of hiding part of the message. According to his investigations, supported by testimonies from high prelates, there was a second page of the third secret, also written by Lucia, but separate from the symbolic vision published. That second fragment contained direct words from the Virgin, warning of a widespread apostasy within the Church, a spiritual crisis that would begin at the summit, and a darkness that would spread from the altar to the highest corners of the Vatican. The words attributed to the Virgin in that supposed lost text were disturbing. Satan will infiltrate even the highest ranks of the Church. Phrases like that were repeated, with variations by different cardinals over the years, without ever receiving official confirmation. One of them, Cardinal Mario Ciappi, personal theologian to 5 pontiffs, declared shortly before dying, "In the third secret, among other things, it is predicted that the great apostasy in the Church will begin at its summit." No one at the Vatican denied it. Lucia, for her part, lived the rest of her life in voluntary seclusion in the convent of the Discalced Carmelites of Coimbra in Portugal. She was rarely allowed to speak to the press, and her letters were strictly controlled by the diocese. In some of her replies, always written with an ambiguous tone, she seems to suggest that she was not completely satisfied with the official interpretation of her vision. In a letter dated 1982, addressed to Pope John Paul II, she wrote, "I have not been authorized to say everything that was shown to me, but the time will come when it will be clearly known." The phrase was quickly downplayed by Vatican spokespersons. In recent years, an even more unsettling theory has begun to circulate among researchers, that the so-called third secret was never the third. That there existed a fourth message, written later, or even an edition dictated by Lucia after a second apparition of the Virgin in the 1950s, and that it was kept under a different protocol, outside the usual archives. This document would be sealed with a specific clause prohibiting its opening until a date not yet revealed, or until the world passes through a certain threshold of spiritual crisis. Some believe that moment has already begun. What is undeniable is that the Vatican has treated the Fatima case with an ambivalence unlike that which it devotes to other Marian phenomena. It has canonized 2 of the little shepherds, held mass gatherings at the sanctuary, and used the message of conversion and prayer as a basis for global campaigns. But at the same time, it has carefully avoided mentioning again the deeper content of the secret, as if it feared reopening a still festering wound within the walls of ecclesiastical power. Today, more than a century after the apparitions, the questions remain. Not as a demand driven by morbid curiosity, but as the echo of something that seems to want to come to light. Because if that final message really spoke of an internal betrayal, of a faith that fades from within, then it is not a secret to be ignored, but one that demands to be understood. And perhaps, in the end, the true secret of Fatima is not only in a paper hidden in a sealed vault, but in the Church's inability to confront its own demons when they no longer come from outside, but have learned to walk in white cassocks, speak with gentle voices, and hide behind sacred stained glass. Thus, the third secret remains not fully revealed, not because it was not written, but perhaps because no one has had the courage to read it aloud. Room 13 of the Vatican, forbidden to all. Within the colossal labyrinth that forms Vatican City, where marble hallways intersect with ancient galleries, and every door leads to a new universe of secrets, there is a room whose mere mention is enough to halt conversations and make gazes drop to the floor. It does not appear on official blueprints, nor in the internal listings of the pontifical governorship. Its existence has never been publicly confirmed, but anyone who has worked long enough in the heart of the Vatican has heard of it, always in whispers, as if naming it were already a form of transgression. This is the enigmatic Room 13, a chamber that is not listed in any visitor guides, whose access is forbidden even to cardinals, and which has remained sealed for centuries by a decision that even the most daring popes have not dared to overturn. References to this room begin to leak in internal documents from the time of Leo X in the 16th century, when the Vatican was going through a period of aesthetic splendor and spiritual decay. It was in this context that some architects serving the Holy See started reporting structural irregularities in the west wing of the Apostolic Palace. They spoke of a sealed space, windowless, located between 2 walls adjoining the Vatican Library, where measurements did not match and blueprints seemed to have been altered without explanation. One of the designers, the Florentine Baldassare Polidori, wrote in a private letter to his brother, "There is a room there, perfectly rectangular, with almost monastic proportions. but it is sealed from the inside, as if it had never been opened. Its door does not conform to the geometry of this building. The wood feels like stone, and its surface is cold as a corpse. From then on, Room 13 began to take shape in the Vatican's imagination as an anomaly, a space that is not accessed, not because it cannot be, but because it should not be. Unlike the numbered rooms in the palace, which are assigned to offices, archives, or private chambers, Number 13 has been absent from all assignment records since its presumed closure. The number does not appear on master keys, nor in internal censuses. Yet, several Swiss guards on night shifts have stated that there is a door between rooms 12 and 14, without an identifying plaque, no visible doorknob, and with a lock so ancient that no modern locksmith has dared to tamper with it. In one of the most cited testimonies, hidden for years and only recently leaked by a former official of the Secretariat of State, a maintenance worker who mistakenly accessed that wing of the building described feeling a heaviness on the chest when passing in front of the door without a number. The sensation was physical, as if the air grew thicker, damper, older. According to his account, the footsteps of those accompanying him began to sound more distant, as if he had entered an acoustic bubble. And when looking at the door, he felt the irrational but overwhelming certainty that something, or someone, was watching him from the other side. The church has never issued any statement about the room. However, there are scattered documents that mention it indirectly under titles such as Internal Retreat Zone, Permanent Closure Space, or Segment 13. In a memorandum dated 1891, written by the then prefect of the Vatican Secret Archives, total restriction of access is ordered to an architecturally unreliable area with a history of liturgical anomalies. The term liturgical anomalies has been debated by historians since it is not a recognized category. Some have interpreted the phrase as a coded reference to heretical practices or unexplained phenomena that allegedly took place within that room centuries ago. According to an oral tradition passed down among certain old members of the clergy, Room 13 was used briefly during the 17th century as a chamber for extreme spiritual retreat exercises. There, priests chosen for their spiritual strength spent entire days in fasting, prayer, and isolation, with the goal of receiving visions or revelations that could assist the Pope in complex theological decisions. However, the results were devastating. Of the 5 men who entered, 3 left with evident signs of mental disorder, 1 died during the retreat, and the last, whose identity was never revealed, remained in absolute silence until his death, never uttering a single word about what he had seen or experienced inside. As a result of these events, the room was closed, its entrance sealed with a mixture of plaster and consecrated ash, and its existence erased from internal roots. Pope Clement IX signed a private bull, now lost, in which it was established that Room 13 shall remain closed until the signs indicated by the Almighty are fulfilled, and that its key must not rest in the hands of men, but in the providence of God. This document is cited in a marginal note of an 18th century minutes book, but has never been found in full. What keeps the legend alive, however, is not the past, but the present. In recent years, various Vatican workers have claimed that during the early mornings, inexplicable sounds can be heard coming from the sealed sector. Muffled bells, whispers in ancient Latin, and a low hum that seems to emerge from the very ground. Some technicians who have worked on electrical repairs near that wing assure that digital clocks stop when passing by the door without a number, and electronic devices lose signal or record interference that cannot be reproduced afterward. There have even been brief episodes of disorientation reported, as if the space around the door subtly changed its geometry. These anomalies have attracted the attention of independent scholars, some of whom have tried to access the place using old maps, construction records, and leaked statements. A retired Jesuit investigator, who requested anonymity, maintains that Room 13 was built over an ancient spiritual vortex, perhaps an intersection of energy lines, or even a site of worship predating Christianity, whose power was never fully neutralized. In his theory, the Vatican decided to enclose the space not out of fear of what it contains, but out of fear of what it might release. Today, Room 13 remains closed, without visible surveillance but surrounded by an aura of silent respect. No one passes in front of it without crossing themselves. No new staff member receives any explanation about its existence, but all learn, within days, that there is a door in the Vatican that simply does not open. Ever. Under any circumstances. Not because there are no curious people, but because those who have tried have not returned with the same convictions they had when they entered. And so, among millennial walls and shadows that never quite dissipate, Room 13 continues waiting. As if it knows its moment has not yet come. As if it is aware that its secret is too ancient to die, and too deep to be spoken aloud. Because perhaps, and only perhaps, there are truths that do not need to be revealed, because they are already there, watching us from the other side of the door. The Floating Choirboy, the Sistine Chapel, with its majestic frescoes and its dense history of conclaves, art, and papal rituals, holds secrets that have transcended generations. It is a place that impresses, overwhelming with its beauty and the symbolic weight of every inch of marble. But within that collection of sacred chambers and closely guarded protocols, there is an episode that few dare to mention. It is not documented in liturgical records, nor in the Vatican archives, yet it has been passed down as a legend that refuses to die. It speaks of a winter night in the 1970s, when a children's choir rehearsal was interrupted by an impossible-to-explain phenomenon. A boy who, without any impulse or assistance, rose into the air before dozens of witnesses. The Vatican's boys' choir, the Schola Puerorum, has existed since medieval times. Made up of voices selected with extreme care, it is tasked with accompanying the most solemn services, and its training is carried out under strict conditions, daily rehearsals, almost monastic discipline, and constant oversight of both manners and emotional health. The story surrounding this particular boy began on a cold December afternoon during a rehearsal before the midnight mass. The chosen space for practice was not the Sistine Chapel, but a smaller chapel adjacent to the Aula delle Benedizioni, a more intimate and enclosed space where the technical details of the singing were prepared before being presented to the liturgical audience. The boy in question, whose identity was carefully erased from all subsequent documents, was 11 years old and considered one of the group's most prodigious talents. His voice, the instructors said, had an inexplicably pure timbre, almost angelic, that moved even veteran musicians. Some claimed he could hold a note for over 16 seconds without changing the pitch, and his tuning was absolutely perfect, requiring no correction in any of the recordings. However, beyond his vocal ability, he was a quiet, withdrawn boy. Very observant, with a gaze many described as absent or excessively serene for his age. He never caused trouble but did not make friends either. He always seemed distant, as if his body were at rehearsal but his soul elsewhere. The night of the incident, according to testimonies that surfaced years later, the group was rehearsing a fragment of the Gloria when the phenomenon occurred. The choir sang normally, the musicians tuned their instruments, and the conductor maintained the rhythm softly. Then, without warning, the boy stopped singing and looked up at the ceiling with wide open eyes. The note continued sounding, but his mouth no longer moved. The conductor, puzzled, lowered his hands. It was at that moment that everything froze. The boy began to rise, first a few centimeters, then more than half a meter, until suspended at the height of the upper stained glass windows. His arms hung at his sides, his body rigid, as if guided by an invisible force that kept him completely vertical, without wobbling. The most disturbing thing was the silence. Everyone present, nuns, musicians, attendants, and peers, was paralyzed. No one screamed, no one moved. They only watched in absolute silence as that figure floated for what some estimated as a full 10 minutes. The chapel's light, dim and warm, seemed to reflect off his skin in a strange way, as if a second light source illuminated him from an impossible point. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the body slowly descended and touched the ground with unnatural softness, making no sound whatsoever. The boy closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and resumed singing exactly where he had stopped. From that day on, everything changed. The choir's leadership was taken over by a new priest. The chapel was sealed for months for structural renovations that never began, and the boy was withdrawn from the group citing an unspecified medical condition. There were no announcements or official reports. However, some of his companions, now adults, have shared fragments of the episode in private interviews. One of them, a retired priest currently residing in Bavaria, stated that the Vatican treated the case as an unauthorized mystical event. According to his words, what happened was interpreted by some as a miracle, and by others as an intrusion. And that internal division is what makes the case more unsettling. Because apparently, the phenomenon was not unanimously interpreted as a divine sign. Some high-ranking Vatican officials, after reviewing the testimonies of those present and observing the boy's subsequent behavior, suggested that it did not come from God. That the levitation, far from being a spiritual grace, was the result of a connection with something that defied the limits of orthodoxy. There was even talk of initiating a discernment process to study whether the boy was the object of possession, angelic intervention, or an unclassified force. The hypothesis that resonated most within internal circles was that the boy was not the origin of the phenomenon, but its channel. That something manifested through him, using his body as an interface, as an antenna for a message that was not spoken in words. Some more radical priests spoke of a Marian echo, a type of vibrational signal that manifests in children before Marian apparitions take place. Others claimed it was a liturgical glow, a rare manifestation of the spirit during sacred chants in a state of absolute innocence. But the reports that reached the secret archive were classified under an unusual label: suspended event. Since then, every time someone has tried to trace the boy or his family, the paths end in administrative dead ends. There is no public birth certificate, nor accessible parish record. Even his name was replaced in the choir books by that of another student. A nun who was present that night, and who was later transferred to a cloistered convent in Umbria, wrote in her personal diary, "The singing floated before his body. I saw the note leave and hold in the air like a spiral. It was pure beauty, and also fear." Her testimony was confiscated by ecclesiastical authorities, but a copy survives in the hands of a Portuguese secular researcher who has spent years documenting anomalous cases within the Vatican. The most unsettling thing, however, is that the phenomenon seemed to repeat, on a smaller scale, years later. At a special mass held in the 1990s, another slight alteration was detected in the choir's acoustics. Internal recordings, never published, show an exact point where one of the children's voices sustains beyond physical limits. The timbre is identical to that of the missing boy. Some theorists have ventured to say that his voice was not of this world, but an acoustic manifestation of something latent, waiting for the right moment to sing again. Thus, among sacred scores and echoes resonating on marble walls, the memory of the floating boy remains like a barely audible whisper in the history of the Vatican. A suspended note, eternal, that no one has been able to completely erase. And perhaps, in some hidden chapel, his song still resonates, lurking in the memory of the air, floating like him. The Black Pope and the prophecy of Saint Malachy. For centuries, prophecies have lived in the shadow of faith, like an uneasy echo that seeps through the folds of dogma. Among all the visions that have tried to decipher the future of the Catholic Church, there is one that, due to its unsettling accuracy and its finalizing nature, has stirred a mixture of fascination, fear, and official silence. the prophecy of the popes, attributed to Saint Malachy, Archbishop of Armagh, Ireland, in the 12th century. According to this vision, received after a journey to Rome, 112 cryptic mottos were listed, each assigned to a future pontiff. And if anything has kept this list alive as an open secret among theologians and scholars, it is that most of the mottos, although brief and enigmatic, seem to fit with disturbing precision the papal figures that followed. But the most chilling part is not the past. What is disturbing is what the end of that list promises. Because motto number 112, the last one, does not mention a symbolic quality like the previous ones. It does not speak of the moon, flowers, the sun, or the cross. It speaks directly of a name, Petrus Romanus. And according to the prophetic text, under this last pope, the church will fall into persecution. Rome will be destroyed, and the final judgment will be revealed. This figure, the last shepherd, has been linked for years to an even darker and deliberately misinterpreted figure, the so-called Black Pope. It is important to clarify that the term Black Pope does not refer to skin color, as some try to trivialize, but to an idea that has circulated for centuries in the most hidden corridors of the Vatican. The possibility that a figure within ecclesiastical power exercises absolute control from the shadows, without having been canonically elected, representing not the will of Christ, but the manipulation of hidden forces. Traditionally, this term has been associated with the superior general of the Society of Jesus, the Jesuit order, due to the color of their habits and the influence they have historically held. But in circles where theology blends with the forbidden, the Black Pope is not simply a man of power, but a prophetic presence, announced as the dark reflection of the last pontiff, as if they were two sides of the same coin. When Jorge Mario Bergoglio was elected as Pope Francis in the year 2013, many eyes turned almost immediately to that figure, not only because of his South American origin or for being the first Jesuit pope in history, but because his election coincided, in number, with the 112th pontiff on Malachy's list. Furthermore, his motto within the prophecy, In persecutione extrema sre sedebit, which translates as, In the final persecution, the Holy Roman Church will sit, leaves no room for ambiguity. There is no symbol, no metaphor. There is a sentence. And for many scholars, Francis is not only the current pope but the last before the prophesied collapse. Adding to this theory is a detail that seems taken from a novel, but appears in multiple unofficial sources. During the election of Francis, the emeritus Pope Benedict XVI was still alive. It was the first time in centuries that two popes lived in the same city, one in office and one retired. But if one understands the concept of pope as a spiritual figure invested with the authority of the throne of Peter, the simultaneous presence of two men with that title cannot go unnoticed by those who believe in the esoteric keys of the prophecy. Some say one represented the light and the other the shadow. Others claim that, in reality, both were instruments of an even deeper transition that has not been fully revealed. There are internal testimonies, leaked by former members of the Vatican, that recount private conversations among cardinals during the conclave that elected Francis, in which the name Malachy was mentioned. One of the oldest cardinals reportedly said before voting, "If we elect him, let it be by conviction, not out of fear of the prophecy." That phrase, preserved in personal diaries, was never denied by the Curia, because the fear was there. The symbolic weight of the prophecy hovered over the election like an invisible presence. The figure of the Black Pope, seen through this lens, does not necessarily refer directly to Francis, but to an entity that accompanies him. Some authors suggest it could be an advisor, a parallel structure, or a spiritual force that has found its space of operation within the Vatican itself. This idea is reinforced by the multiple strange episodes that have taken place since Francis's election. Sudden resignations of bishops, corruption scandals that seem lifted from a spy novel, And above all, the silent strengthening of Jesuit structures in ecclesiastical administration. Nothing has been accidental. Every move has been perceived by the most attentive believers as part of an invisible orchestration beyond the human. A little-known detail is that in 1994, then Cardinal Carlo Maria Martini, Jesuit and Archbishop of Milan, wrote a prophetic letter warning that the next great shock to the Church will come from within, not from its enemies, but from those who believe they are saving it. Years later, he would be a key elector in the conclave that chose Benedict XVI, although many suspect his intention had been to promote Bergoglio since then. The figure of the Savior from the shadows fits, disturbingly, with the profile of the Black Pope. But the true fear does not lie in what the Black Pope might do, but in what he could mean. Because if the prophecy is correct, his presence is a sign, not a threat. It is the indication that we have entered the time of irreversible decisions, a moment in which the Church must face its darkest part, not from the outside, as it did during the Crusades, wars, or the Reformation, but from its very core. And in that confrontation, the Black Pope is not the villain. He is the mirror. Of course, the Vatican has always rejected these theories. It has limited itself to classifying the prophecy of Saint Malachi as a document of doubtful authenticity, probably written in the 17th century to influence the conclaves of the time. But even among the most skeptical archivists, there is tacit recognition that the coincidence between the mottos and the elected popes is at the very least uncomfortable. The dates align, the metaphors match, and the end, that number 112 without an apparent succession, is there, waiting. Today, as the world watches how the Vatican navigates a time of reforms, scandals, and internal tensions, the figure of the Black Pope, literal or symbolic, remains latent. He does not appear in press releases or Sunday homilies, but he is present in whispers behind walls, in glances exchanged in corridors, in documents that can only be read in the deepest archives. And perhaps the most disturbing thing of all is not that the prophecy is about to be fulfilled, but that it is already being fulfilled, and no one wants to admit it. Because, as with the oldest secrets, the greatest power of a prophecy lies not in its literal fulfillment, but in its ability to make us doubt whether we are living in the present or in the epilogue. The reliquary that does not reflect light. Deep within the secret archives of the Vatican, a place whose new name, the Vatican Apostolic Archive, has not managed to strip away its aura of mystery, there is a preservation room that holds some of the strangest and oldest objects ever collected by the Church. There, not only documents, papal bulls, and manuscripts are kept, there are also reliquaries, containment boxes, artifacts sealed with papal wax, all wrapped in legends that centuries have failed to dissolve. And among them all, there is one that has caused more bewilderment than any other because its behavior defies a fundamental law of the universe. It does not reflect light. The object in question appears simple, and perhaps that is the first trap for anyone trying to understand it. It is a reliquary barely 15 centimeters tall, shaped like a Latin cross, supposedly made of aged silver, and mounted on an octagonal base reminiscent of medieval reliquary structures, especially those used to preserve fragments of bone, hair, or small belongings of martyred saints. At first glance, it could be mistaken for any religious piece from past centuries. However, what distinguishes it, what makes it a puzzling anomaly, is its interaction with light. It does not matter if it is observed under a tungsten lamp, an LED light, or the natural midday light of Rome. The reliquary casts no shadow, does not shine, and its edges remain always in unchanging twilight. It seems to absorb every ray that reaches it. The scientists summoned by the Vatican in the year 1947, during a secret effort of cataloging and analysis, were completely perplexed. According to the reports written then, which were classified and restricted to a very select group of cardinals, The surface of the reliquary was neither opaque nor reflective, but something entirely different, a kind of visual void. One of the physicists involved in the investigation, an Italian exiled from the academic community for his anti-clerical views, wrote in a letter he managed to smuggle out of Rome, "I have never seen anything like it. It is as if that object refuses to exist under the laws of the world. It does not cast a shadow because it emits nothing. It does not reflect light because it does not receive it. Looking at it for a long time causes vertigo, as if one were peering over the edge of something bottomless." But the mystery of the reliquary goes beyond its optical properties, because according to even older documents, belonging to the pontificate of Urban VIII, this piece arrived in the hands of the Vatican under extraordinary circumstances. The legend says it was recovered in the ruins of a French abbey, destroyed during the religious wars in the 16th century. Amid the chaos, soldiers found an altar completely intact, and upon it, the reliquary, suspended in the air, as if floating above the stone. The description may seem fantastic, but it was recorded in at least 3 different military chronicles, including the personal diary of a Huguenot captain, who wrote with a mixture of fear and awe. That was not the work of craftsmen. It was an object born from darkness. Once transferred to Rome, the reliquary was analyzed by the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, which at that time was still known as the Holy Inquisition. The verdict was unsettling. No type of relic could be identified inside. The reliquary, as a sacred container, was completely empty. It held no bone, no tissue, no fragment of clothing. And yet, when brought close to other relics, these reacted strangely. Some cracked, others lost their color, and there were even recorded cases where the reliquary emitted a low hum, almost imperceptible, when within less than a meter from particularly ancient objects. That hum was later measured and found to be a constant frequency of 33 hertz, a number symbolically associated with the age of Christ at the time of his crucifixion. This fact led some theologians to propose an even more disturbing hypothesis, that the reliquary does not contain something, but is itself a remnant of something greater. A fragment of a sacred or profane object that was destroyed, scattered, or confined in parts, as if it were a seal, an anchor, or a key. Throughout the centuries, the Vatican has tried to lock it up, move it, hide it under new vaults, and inexplicable things have always happened. One of the most documented events occurred in 1972, when a group of restorers was assigned to catalog the contents of a newly reopened underground room beneath the Apostolic Library. When they reached the compartment where the reliquary was kept, all the watches of the team stopped exactly at 3:33 in the afternoon. They did not fail due to battery or magnetic fields. The internal mechanisms were damaged, as if an invisible force had strained them until breaking their logic. Since then, direct handling has been forbidden. Today, the reliquary is locked inside a lead box lined with silk, blessed by 3 different popes. The box can only be opened in the presence of the apostolic archivist, a member of the Swiss Guard specially trained and, according to internal sources, a high-ranking exorcist. Because what the Vatican fears most is not what the reliquary might do, but what it might be calling. Some reports, never officially disclosed, describe recurring dreams among employees who have been near the object. They dream of a choir singing underground, of hallways opening by themselves, of a hooded figure holding the reliquary upside down, as if it were a torch that, instead of illuminating, consumes the very light. Other more recent accounts claim that the reliquary has been linked to certain unexplained incidents in St. Peter's Basilica during the pandemic. Lights turning off without reason, chalices breaking without contact, figures momentarily disappearing from security cameras. Nothing has been officially acknowledged, but some clergy members assert that the reliquary acts as a kind of spiritual radar. When something approaches the walls of the Vatican, it senses it first, and by doing so, it changes subtly. Its surface becomes even more opaque, the air around it denser, and the birds, the doves of the atrium, cease to perch on the building. The most baffling thing is that no one knows who created it, for what purpose, or why it behaves the way it does. There are theories linking it to Gnostic traditions, lost rituals of the early Christians, or even the cursed relics of the Templars. Some claim it was extracted from a church built over the ruins of a pagan temple, where forgotten cults to entities older than the saints were practiced. Others go further and say it is a physical manifestation of the silence of God, an object that does not reflect light because it does not come from this world, but from a place where light never entered. Today, the reliquary that does not reflect light remains kept in a windowless room, behind 3 different locks, under the watch of men who know they are guarding something they do not fully understand. But sometimes, they say, on the quietest nights, someone hears a faint metallic creak coming from inside the box, as if the reliquary, though sealed, is still waiting. And in that murmur without light, many believe there is a message, a reminder that not everything that shines is divine, and not everything that remains in shadows is simply darkness. Sometimes it is a mystery, one the Vatican would prefer no one look at too closely. The woman who visited hell and returned to confess it. The story circulated for years within the hidden corridors of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, filed under an untitled number, with access limited to 3 senior theologians. Those who heard it whispered simply called it the penitent's case, as if naming it might summon more than just the memory. Its origin is not from some exotic country or remote lands where mysticism blends with superstition. It happened in the very heart of Italy, in a cloistered convent located on the outskirts of Perugia, where a woman known as Julia appeared one morning with a distressed face and her hands wrapped in bandages, claiming something as extraordinary as unsettling, that she had been dragged to hell, had seen it with her own eyes, and had come to confess it, because she had been sent back with a purpose. Julia was not just any woman. Born into a middle-class Catholic family, she had been raised by nuns from childhood and led a deeply spiritual life, without any apparent episodes of imbalance. She was a mother of 2 children, a music teacher at a local parish, and known for her reserved character and constant serenity. But in the year 1988, something changed. It began with a series of unexplained fainting spells during masses, accompanied by an abnormally fast pulse and a kind of transient fever that no doctor could diagnose. Later came the dreams, so vivid that upon waking, her body showed physical signs, marks, bruises, superficial burns. It was her husband who, in desperation, took her to consult a priest experienced in mystical phenomena. That priest, whose name has been protected by the Vatican, held long conversations with her before forwarding the case to Rome. Julia claimed that during one of her unconscious episodes, she had been taken by an unknown force, a kind of wind that did not blow from outside, but from inside her body. She said the sensation was of falling, an endless fall through a breathing darkness, as if it had a life of its own. The next thing she remembered was a landscape she described with such distressing precision that several theologians concluded she could not have invented it. An endless plain of burning ash, where human figures crawled without legs, with open mouths that made no sound at all, because the pain they suffered was beyond screaming. According to her account, hell was not a place of fire as depicted in ancient paintings, but a state of absolute consciousness, where all pain was felt simultaneously and all regret turned into acid that corroded the soul. There were no clocks, no light, no words, only pure understanding, and that understanding was the punishment. The most disturbing claim was that every condemned soul knew exactly why it was there, without need for judgment or accusation. As if hell were a truth one already knows, only revealed upon crossing an invisible threshold. The experience, according to Julia, lasted what seemed to her like years, but upon waking, only 18 minutes had passed, she was found unconscious on the bathroom floor of her house, with dilated pupils and burned palms, as if she had held burning coals. The doctors who treated her found no organic cause for the fainting, but did find physical evidence impossible to explain. The forensic report, of which a copy exists in ecclesiastical archives, indicates that the burns were superficial but symmetrical, shaped like concentric rings, and that no human could have caused them in the position in which she was found. After her partial recovery, Julia requested to be admitted to a convent. There she began writing compulsively, filling notebooks with drawings, Latin phrases she had never studied, and increasingly detailed descriptions of her experience. She claimed hell had levels, like concentric layers, and that in the deepest of all dwelled a silence so dense it could break the mind. In that place, according to her words, God did not exist, not because he was absent, but because the condemned soul no longer had the capacity to perceive him. "It is like a blind man facing the sun," she wrote. "The sun is there, but for him, it does not exist." The priests attending her began recording strange phenomena around her. Crucifixes that fell for no reason, religious images that spontaneously cracked in her presence, candles that extinguished upon entering the chapel. One of her confessors, a robust man not inclined to mysticism, suffered a nervous breakdown after hearing one of her descriptions. He refused to reveal what she had told him, but left the ministry a few months later and lived in complete isolation until his death. What really triggered the Vatican's interest was a particular confession. Julia claimed she had not returned alone, that something had followed her, not as a physical presence, but as a persistent connection, a kind of energetic mark she could not remove. She began dreaming of a faceless figure watching her from a corner of her room, and described feeling, in the quietest moments, an icy breath behind her neck. By order of the local bishop, 3 minor exorcism sessions were performed, not because she was possessed, but as a precaution. However, in each of them, the priests noticed an anomaly. When they approached her with holy water, it evaporated before touching her skin. The case was raised to the dicastery for the causes of saints, not with the intention of canonizing her, but to analyze whether it was a genuine mystical experience or a psychic disorder with unusual physical manifestations. After months of analysis, the conclusion was inconclusive. Some saw signs of a dark night of the soul, an extreme spiritual purification that few humans can endure. Others insisted it was a deeply studied simulation, though they could not explain how a woman without theological training could write entire phrases in classical Latin, with correct grammatical structures, and even biblical quotes found only in archaic versions of the Old Testament. Julia lived her last years in total silence. She gave no interviews, never spoke of her experience again, and stopped writing altogether. She only asked to be buried without a name, in a remote cemetery, with a small cross without inscription. But before dying, she handed her confessor a box with a single handwritten sheet. It said, "God let me see hell, not to punish me, but to remind me that it is real. I did not return to tell of its existence. I returned to live knowing I have touched it." That document, along with the original notebooks, remains in custody in a sealed vault in the Vatican. And although the story has never been publicly acknowledged, some priests, when they dare to speak in confidence, assure that it was all true, that the woman existed, that her confession was heard, and that hell, more than a place, is a memory that never fades. Because there are testimonies that do not seek to convince, but to leave a mark. And when a person claims to have seen what no one wants to see, the truly terrifying thing is not whether they told the truth, but whether someone, someday, will also be forced to remember it. The Christ who opened his eyes, before Pope Pius XII. It was the year 1954. The Second World War was behind them, although its wounds remained open in the streets, in the churches, and in the memory of millions. Europe was beginning to rebuild itself with great difficulty, and in the heart of Rome, a man dressed in white carried the weight of a world still trembling. Pope Pius XII, called by many the Pope of Silence, by others, God's diplomat, but by those who knew him closely, simply Eugenio Pacelli, a lonely man, deeply devoted and marked by an intense spirituality that sometimes bordered on mystery. Among all the pontiffs of the 20th century, Pius XII was perhaps the most reserved, the most mystical, the one who spent the most time in prayer and contemplation. His days were long, rigorous, and marked by almost unchangeable rituals. One of these was to visit daily the private chapel located in the Vatican gardens, a small space decorated with Byzantine mosaics and a crucifix carved from dark wood that had presided over the altar for more than a century. That crucified Christ was not of extraordinary artistic value, but its expression was so human, so deeply pained, that the few who had seen it in person claimed to feel that the sculpted face's closed eyes seemed barely asleep, rather than dead. Before that figure, something happened that the official history of the Vatican has never publicly acknowledged, but which was recorded in private letters, personal diaries of witnesses, and, most disturbingly, in a confidential report delivered by the Pope himself to a small group of cardinals. On the night of November 25th, 1954, after an exhausting day of meetings, Pius XII retired to his chapel as usual. That day, however, he did so without escorts, without secretaries, only with a breviary in his hands and a paler face than usual, according to one of his assistants who later recounted the event. He locked the door and did not come out for several hours. When he finally did, his face was transformed. Not from exhaustion or age, but by an expression of absolute bewilderment. That night he did not say a word. He walked silently to his rooms and locked himself in without dinner. The next day he summoned 3 cardinals from his closest circle and calmly recounted what had happened. According to his testimony, during his prayer before the crucifix, he suddenly felt an unusual silence, deeper than what was normal in that place. Then, the air seemed to thicken, as if the atmosphere itself had changed its weight. It was then that he raised his gaze and saw the impossible. The eyes of the crucified Christ opened. It was not an optical illusion, said the Pope. It was not a reflection, nor a play of light, nor a slip of a tired mind. The eyes, carved in wood for over 100 years, slowly separated, revealing black, deep, motionless pupils that looked at him with an indescribable expression. There was no fury, no comfort, no joy, only presence, an absolute presence that left him paralyzed. Pius XII fell to his knees, unable to speak. He felt time had stopped, that prayer no longer needed to come from his lips because it was no longer necessary. In his own words, "It was as if he already knew everything I came to say." The phenomenon lasted only a few seconds, or perhaps minutes. He never knew for sure. He only remembered that, little by little, the Christ's eyelids closed again, and silence regained its usual form. But something inside him had changed forever. In the following days, he withdrew even more into himself. He limited his public appearances and began writing long letters that no one fully understood, filled with references to the gaze that weighs and the silence that watches from the cross. Even his personal confession changed. He asked to receive the sacrament daily, as if needing purification before something that had spiritually stripped him bare. The news of what had happened was kept in the strictest secrecy, although it began to leak in closed circles. One of the cardinals present during the account wrote in his diary that he had never seen the Pope tremble until that day. It was not fear on his face, he noted. It was reverence, as if he had witnessed a truth forbidden to the rest of us. Another witness, an elderly Monsignor, recounted in a secret interview decades later that the Pope had contemplated a living Christ in death, and that since then, his decisions were governed not by diplomacy, but by knowledge he could not share. Many theories have been woven around that moment. Some maintain it was a mystical vision, an ecstasy induced by meditation and fasting. Others claim it was a real manifestation, a miracle reserved for one who had to carry the world's weight during an especially dark period. There are those who say the event marked a turning point in Pius XII's pontificate, a shift that made him more reserved, more obsessed with the apocalypse, and more determined to keep secrets that perhaps should never be revealed. The truth is that after that event, the crucifix was removed from the chapel and quietly replaced by another. The original was taken to a private room in the Apostolic Palace and has remained out of public reach since then. Only a few have been able to see it closely since, and all of them, without exception, agree on one thing. There is something strange about its face. It is not that the eyes are open, nor that there are visible marks. It is more subtle. They say the Christ seems about to awaken, that every time someone stares at it intently, doubt creeps into the mind. What if this time it also opens its eyes? Decades later, when Pope Benedict XVI began reviewing Pius XII's personal documents with the aim of advancing his cause for beatification, he found a letter that was never sent. It was addressed to the future pontiff who must bear the weight of the final decision. In it, Pius XII spoke of a gaze that holds all the answers, but demands silence as the only form of faithfulness. No one knows exactly what he meant, but that letter was considered so relevant that it was archived in a special section of the Congregation for the Causes of Saints, under triple seal. Today, the crucifix still exists. Some say it has been seen by subsequent popes, and that one of them, after observing it for several minutes, decided never to enter that room alone again. Some assert that Christ did not open his eyes to send a message, but as a warning, a sign that something was coming, something that required the direct attention of Peter's successor, a kind of last look before finally closing the eyelids. And perhaps the most chilling thing is not the act itself, but its possible repetition. Because if it happened once, what would prevent it from happening again? What if it did not happen before a pope, but before the whole world? What if that silent gaze was the only thing humanity needed to understand that there is still something beyond power, history, and dogma? Perhaps that is why the crucifix remains hidden. Because it is not just a piece of sacred art, nor a religious figure. It is a threshold, a crack between the visible and the invisible. And whoever crosses it, like Pius XII that night, never looks at the world the same way again. Because after seeing Christ open his eyes, silence is no longer an option. It is a commitment, one that, to this day, the Vatican keeps with a solemnity that chills the bones. The inner cult of the blood of the martyrs. Deep within the Vatican, where neither tourists nor pilgrims have access, there are rooms sealed tight for centuries. These are not hidden corridors or chambers forgotten by time, but carefully preserved spaces where the scent of wax, incense, and ancient wood blends with something denser, thicker. Something that, although it cannot be named, is breathed with every step. There, according to certain testimonies collected in internal documents never made public, a cult is practiced that very few have heard of, an arcane ritual centered on a specific element, equally sacred and feared: the blood of the martyrs. Since the earliest centuries of Christianity, the blood of those who gave their lives for faith has been considered a relic of incalculable value. The oldest patristic texts insist that the blood shed in the name of Christ possesses a spiritual dimension that transcends the body and consecrates the soul, becoming almost a bridge between the earthly and the eternal. However, over the centuries, this principle transformed. What began as symbolic veneration slowly became something more intimate, more hidden, more selective. At some point, and no one knows exactly when, the Church stopped showing the blood and began preserving it. The so-called inner cult, an unofficial name used by researchers in the Apostolic Archive, is not mentioned in any catechism, papal constitution, or even liturgical records. It has no date, no mass, no procession. It is only transmitted orally, from cardinal to cardinal, as knowledge reserved for those who have been tested in the depths of their faith. The few details that have leaked coincide on one point. There is an underground chamber inside the Vatican, identified on old maps as Sanctum Cruoris, the sanctuary of the blood, where ampules of martyr blood are kept that were never publicly canonized. What is disturbing is that most of these ampules do not come from open tombs or approved relics, but from secret findings, fragments gathered at places of martyrdom and preserved through rituals not practiced in any recognized liturgy. In some cases, it is mentioned that the blood was collected moments before death by anonymous hands who knew what they were doing. In others, the relics were found still pulsating, as if they preserved a pulse impossible centuries after being shed. The existence of this cult was first hinted at in the personal diary of a German theologian, Father Dietrich Vollmer, who in the 1960s worked as an advisor to the Congregation for the Causes of Saints. In one of his last entries, before disappearing under circumstances never clarified, he wrote, "I have seen the heart of Rome, and it does not beat with faith. It beats with blood." Years later, another priest, the Italian Jesuit Paolo Ventresca, indirectly confirmed the existence of a purification ritual practiced on very specific dates, exclusively during new moon nights, attended only by 4 people per ceremony, 3 cardinals and a custodian of the sanctum. This ritual was not intended to worship, but to listen. The blood, it is said, is capable of speaking, transmitting fragments of suffering, vision, truth. And upon contact with certain prayers, ancient, forbidden even to most of the clergy, these relics could reveal hidden episodes of the Church's history. A drop placed on a consecrated stone under the recitation of certain Aramaic psalms would begin to smoke, change color, or even, according to the most extreme testimonies, emit a barely audible whisper, as if telling its story. It was not a voice, they said, but an echo, an emotional residue so intense it could break the will of anyone who listened unprepared. Over the centuries, several popes have been directly or indirectly linked to this secret cult. Innocent III is said to have ordered 3 of the most active ampules locked away after suffering recurring nightmares in which the martyrs reproached him for his decisions. Benedict XIV, a scholar obsessed with miracle validation, spent years studying the chemical patterns of the blood without finding any natural explanation. But it was during the pontificate of Pius XI that the cult reached its peak. The Pope is said to have authorized the reconstruction of the Sanctum Cruoris, damaged during 19th century works, and requested to be the only one holding the key to the entrance. According to unofficial inventories, that key was never returned. What is most unsettling, however, is not the existence of a secret cult, nor even the preservation of blood in an apparently living state. What really disturbs is that some of these relics do not correspond to officially registered martyrs. There are ampules without names, without dates, without recognized causes. Some even come from regions where Christian persecution has never been documented. Yet their energy, according to the custodians, is more intense than that of any other vial. What does that mean? Could there be martyrs who did not die for Christ, but for truths the Vatican never wanted to accept? There is an even bolder theory. Some independent scholars, based on leaked sources, believe that inside the Sanctum Cruoris, there is a relic that is not human blood, but something that transcends that category. A dark, thick liquid contained in a capsule sealed with 7 locks, which can only be opened under a formula divided among 7 custodians spread around the world. This substance of unknown origin would have been found in an excavation beneath one of Rome's oldest catacombs, alongside a skeleton whose morphology does not match any known human species. The Church has never confirmed or denied this finding, but has imposed absolute silence on any reference to that excavation. The truth is that year after year, the cult persists, discreet, sealed, impenetrable. The blood has not stopped being collected or venerated. Some drops are even secretly sent to cloistered convents, where mystic nuns pray day and night before them, as if they could soothe their pulsations. Because that is another constant. The blood moves. There are days when it bubbles, others when it remains completely solid, and others when it disappears for hours and then reappears, as if it needs to rest. The Vatican remains silent. It neither denies nor admits it. It is one of those secrets kept by inertia, by necessity, as if revealing it would open something else irreversibly. And perhaps that is why, every so often, when a cardinal rises to a position of power, someone whispers to him that there is a place below the altar where faith takes on a denser form, a liquid form, a form that breathes. And so, while pilgrims walk over the slabs of St. Peter's, unaware of the pulse beating beneath their feet, a chosen few descend to the Sanctum Cruoris to contemplate the blood that does not dry, to listen to what cannot be heard, to participate in a ritual that seeks to explain nothing, only to remember that some truths are not preached, they are shed, and they remain there, latent in the shadows, waiting for someone brave enough or naive enough to call them forth again. The Screaming Cross. On the outskirts of the Vatican, where shadows grow longer and the doors remain closed even to the highest prelates, there exists an object that is neither displayed in glass cases nor mentioned in any homily. Known to a few as the Screaming Cross, its story has been carefully silenced by generations of archivists, not because it is an inconvenient forgery or heresy, but because the object in question, according to hidden reports, emits a sound that chills the blood. A prolonged and unnatural scream that does not come from human vocal cords, yet seems to arise from the very heart of the wood. The cross was discovered in the year 1891 during the restoration of a small ruined chapel in northern Tuscany, near the ruins of a Benedictine monastery abandoned since the 17th century. At first glance, it was no more than a wooden crucifix, without artistic value or striking decorations, with the body of Christ roughly sketched onto the cross by rudimentary carvings. But what caught the workers' attention was not its design, but the fact that the cross was nailed inside a marble slab that had withstood intact centuries of neglect, humidity, and looting, as if the passage of time simply did not affect it. A local priest was called to examine it, and what happened then was recorded in his diary, which is still preserved, classified, in the Vatican's secret archives. According to his testimony, when he touched the cross with his bare hand, he heard a muffled groan, a long, deep moan that could not have originated from the wind, because the doors were closed and the windows sealed. The sound seemed to come from inside the wood, as if it were alive, or as if it held in its fibers a lament that had not yet found peace. That same night, the priest dreamed of a crucified, faceless figure whose empty eye sockets followed him from an altar covered in blood. The next morning, he requested that the object be sent discreetly to Rome. There began the true story of this cross. Once placed in the Vatican's basements, it was examined by a group of theologians and restorers who soon detected the inexplicable. The wood did not correspond to any known species in Europe. It was denser than mahogany, darker than ebony, yet it had no visible grain. The carved body on it seemed to move slightly in the candlelight, and the lips of Christ, although still, gave the illusion of murmuring something unintelligible when observed for long periods. But the most disturbing event occurred weeks later. During one of the study sessions, in a silent chamber, the cross screamed. It was not a collective hallucination, nor an external noise. The sound was recorded on an experimental phonograph that the Vatican used to document certain Gregorian chants. On the tape, which was played only once and then archived with a black seal, a prolonged, heartbreaking lament can be heard. growing as if emerging from the depths of the earth. It has no human modulation or recognizable tone. It is a sound that breaks the air, that shatters the soul. One of the attendees suffered a nervous breakdown at that moment and had to be hospitalized for more than a year in a psychiatric institution, where he never spoke clearly again about what had happened. Since then, extreme precautions were taken. The cross was locked in a lead box, covered with blessed cloths, and guarded by a small order of exorcist monks trained in silence, fasting, and isolation. They were instructed never to speak to the object or direct any thought to it, for one more reckless priest claimed to have heard answers to his prayers, answers that did not come from God. Some have tried to explain the phenomenon from a scientific perspective. Some suggest that the acoustic properties of the wood could be altered by an unknown process, and that changes in temperature or humidity could cause an amplified internal vibration. But this theory does not explain why the scream only occurs in the presence of believing people, nor why it has never been reproduced twice under the same conditions. The Vatican has publicly denied the existence of this cross, but several internal reports confirm it has been moved at least 3 times to different locations within the pontifical state due to a supposed reactivation of its sound manifestation. The last of these was in 2006, when then Pope Benedict XVI requested a private session of contemplation with the relic. No one knows what happened in that room, but upon leaving, the pontiff canceled a public audience and spent 48 hours in complete retreat, without speaking a word, not even during the private Sunday Mass. Rumors grew. Some claim that the scream of the cross is not a residue of human suffering, but a warning, a kind of sacred alarm activated when the world approaches a point of no return. There are records of the cross screaming during the days leading up to the outbreak of the Second World War, and again the night before the assassination attempt on John Paul II. Is it possible that this relic is connected to the greatest pains of humanity? Is it a divine instrument of perception, or something older, darker, that has been mistaken for a Christian relic when, in reality, it belongs to a much more primitive tradition? A marginal theory, never accepted but carefully archived, holds that the cross was not carved to be venerated but to seal, that its Christian shape is only a facade over a much older object, and that what screams inside is not the voice of Christ, but that of something imprisoned there by means of a sacrifice. In other words, the cross does not represent pain. It contains it. And that pain, every so often, tries to escape. Whatever the case, the cross still exists. Locked, sealed, hidden. Some say it is in the tunnels connecting the basilica with the secret archive. Others that it was buried under holy ground in Castel Gandolfo. But there are always those who swear they have heard it, even if they have not seen it. A whisper among the walls of the Vatican, a howl perceived only if one has lost all hope, a lament of living wood. And perhaps the most chilling thing of all is that some claim the cross has begun to scream more frequently in recent years. It is not always heard, but dogs howl for no reason on the quietest nights in the Vatican, and the bells sometimes ring with a deeper echo than usual, as if something were announcing its return, as if the cross can no longer contain what it holds inside. Because sometimes the most sacred symbol can become the most feared threshold, and a screaming cross may not be asking for help. It may be warning that the worst has yet to begin. Document 402X, the end of the Vatican. The Vatican Apostolic Archive, formerly known as the Secret Archive, is one of the most enigmatic repositories of knowledge in the world. Guarded by silence, protocol, and centuries of tradition, it holds in its vaults documents that have never been read outside the most intimate circle of the Holy See. But among these sealed files, among papal bulls, coded correspondences, and classified testimonies, there is one that has inspired more fear than any other. Its name, recorded only on a handwritten list of restricted access documents, is 402X. And in the corridors where people dare to whisper, that code has one meaning: the day the Vatican will cease to exist. The first mention of document 402X appears in an inventory from 1927, when Pope Pius XI ordered a reorganization of the internal archives of the Apostolic Palace. Among thousands of entries, one stands out with three unusual features. It has no explicit author, no date of issuance, and instead of an ordinary description, it bears a single handwritten warning. Only for the reigning pontiff, open when the signal is given. Since then, no supreme pontiff has wished to confirm its content, but all, without exception, have been aware of its existence. What makes 402X such a great, impenetrable secret is that no one outside the Pope has ever read its pages. However, throughout the 20th century, fragments of information began to leak, not due to indiscretions by the clergy, but because of filing errors, marginal notes, and strange administrative decisions. In 1958, for example, Cardinal Ottaviani, prefect of the Holy Office and one of the most conservative guardians of the faith, sent a sealed note to his assistant with a cryptic instruction: "If the Holy Father opens 402X, activate Clement Protocol." That note, which should not have survived, was found years later among documents reviewed during the Second Vatican Council. The Clement Protocol, until then unknown, included measures of isolation, temporary suspension of external communications, and preparation of a public emergency announcement. It was as if the Vatican anticipated, at some point in the future, its own collapse. The existence of a prophetic document is not new in the history of the Church. From the so-called prophecies of St. Malachi to the Fatima letters, the Vatican has been the custodian of visions and warnings that seem to point, one way or another, to an imminent end. But what makes document 402X unique is that it does not come from a mystic, a saint, or a Marian apparition. Internal legends claim it was written following a secret meeting held in 1583 under the pontificate of Gregory XIII between Jesuit astronomers, alchemists protected by the Holy See, and a group of Syriac monks who claimed to possess an ancient codex lost during the sack of Alexandria. From that meeting, never recorded in official minutes, a manuscript emerged which those present called the final letter. The Vatican, always a jealous guardian of its secrets, decided to keep that text under multiple layers of concealment, rewriting it with encrypted code, subdividing it into fragments, and finally compiling it into a single volume under the technical title 402X. Rumors hold that the document contains a precise, detailed, and dated prediction of the end of the Vatican as a worldly institution, not as a political dissolution or a loss of faith, but as a definitive interruption of its physical existence, its spiritual authority, and its capacity to act in the world. What is even more puzzling is that certain details of this supposed content have been hinted at by popes at very specific moments. John XXIII, for example, during one of his private speeches in 1961, mentioned between the lines that the Church will someday have to yield its form to save its soul. Paul VI, after personally reading the third secret of Fatima, whispered to his secretary that the seals of the ancient blood are almost broken. And Benedict XVI, in an interview after his resignation, an unprecedented modern act, hinted that the most important message has not been delivered to the world because the world would not yet know how to interpret it. Is it possible that these fragments allude to the content of 402X? Many scholars believe so. There has been talk of a date inscribed in the document, a future day that would mark the beginning of a series of irreversible events: earthquakes, internal fractures in the hierarchy, appearance of apocryphal documents discrediting doctrine, and finally, the physical occupation of Vatican City by forces alien to the Church, not necessarily military, but capable of altering its functioning from within. Others claim the document does not describe the end as an external catastrophe, but as an implosion, a progressive loss of moral authority, accompanied by a growing revelation of secrets contained in the archives, which would undermine all legitimacy from its roots. And there is an even more unsettling version, mentioned in a manuscript by Father Malachi Martin, who was a Jesuit and insider of the deepest corridors of the Vatican. He believed that 402X contained not an event, but a theological equation, a kind of irreversible sentence inscribed in human history since before the founding of Rome, an equation in which the Vatican must exist for a determined time, fulfill its symbolic role, and disappear before the rise of a new form of spirituality without center, leader, or hierarchy, something like a divine retreat. To this day, document 402X remains sealed in a red leather-bound box, protected by 3 keys, each held by a different member of the Roman Curia. It is reviewed periodically, not to open it, but to verify that it remains intact. And each new pope, on the 3rd day after his election, is informed of its existence. He is told he may open it if he deems it necessary, but also warned that reading it means accepting consequences that cannot be undone. To date, no pontiff has confirmed having read it. Although some gestures, some decisions, some resignations have hinted that perhaps they have. The Vatican still stands. Its dome still shines under the Roman sun. Its ceremonies continue. Its pilgrims keep arriving. But the echo of 402X persists among those who know its shadow. It is a secret not hidden behind walls, but suspended in time, waiting for a signal, whatever is encoded in its warning, to manifest. And when it does, there will be no turning back. Perhaps that day there will be no explosions, no screams, no chaos. Perhaps simply a pope will open the box, read its content, and decide not to hold mass the next day. Perhaps the halls will empty quietly, and the keys will fall on the marble one last time, because some secrets reveal themselves with a shout, and others end with a whisper. 402X, say the few who dare to speak its name, is not a document. It is a destiny. And its last line, according to the only person who claimed to have read it before disappearing without a trace, is not written in Latin, but in ancient Hebrew, and it translates simply as "Et erit sicut si non fuisse," and it will be as if it had never existed. If this darkness left you thinking, imagine what we have yet to reveal. Subscribe to keep exploring the secrets others prefer to keep silent. Leave us a like if you dared to read until the end. And remember, on this channel, mystery never rests. Good night.